What if one decision could change the course of history forever? What if a single moment of choice, made centuries ago, still echoes through time, shaping our world in ways we can barely comprehend? History is filled with these pivotal moments, instances where leaders stood at crossroads, their decisions rippling across generations, building empires or bringing them crashing down. Today, we're diving deep into the minds of ancient rulers whose controversial choices still spark fierce debate among historians and enthusiasts alike. These weren't just minor missteps, they were monumental, jaw-dropping decisions that determined the fate of civilizations and left behind legacies of both chaos and wonder. Picture this: you're a leader with the weight of an entire kingdom on your shoulders. One wrong move could mean defeat, disgrace, or even the collapse of everything your people have built. From disastrous military campaigns that cost thousands of lives to shocking personal betrayals that rewrote the rules of power, the ancient world was a stage for some of the most dramatic and consequential choices ever made. These leaders weren't just figures in dusty history books, they were human beings facing impossible dilemmas, driven by ambition, fear, love, or sheer audacity. And their stories remind us that history isn't just about dates and events. It's about people, their passions, and the paths they chose. In this video, we'll embark on a thrilling countdown of 25 of the most controversial decisions ever made by ancient leaders. We'll explore the motives behind these choices, the immediate and long-term consequences, and why they continue to captivate and confound us to this day. You'll encounter tales of brilliant strategies that defied all odds and catastrophic blunders that serve as cautionary tales for the ages. This journey isn't just about revisiting the past, it's about understanding the incredible power of decision-making and how it shapes the world we live in now. So settle in and get ready to explore the moments that changed everything, because history has never been more fascinating or more human. Our journey into history's most controversial decisions begins in the summer of 64 AD, with the Roman Empire at the height of its power and a city in flames. For 6 devastating days and 7 nights, a fire raged through the ancient capital, consuming everything in its path. Of Rome's 14 districts, only 4 remained untouched. 3 were completely leveled, reduced to smoldering ash and rubble. The human cost was unimaginable, with countless lives lost and hundreds of thousands left homeless. Their world turned to cinders, and in the center of this chaos stood the young emperor Nero. Rather than a unifying force, he became a figure of intense suspicion. Ancient historians like Tacitus recorded the rumors that began to swirl almost immediately. Whispers that the emperor himself had ordered the fire set, that he had famously fiddled while his city burned. A story likely more allegorical than literal, but one that captured the public's fury. Facing a terrified and angry populace, Nero needed a distraction, a group to shoulder the blame and absolve him of any guilt. He found his scapegoat in a small, mysterious, and widely misunderstood sect, the Christians. To the average Roman, Christians were a secretive and strange group. They refused to participate in the public worship of the traditional gods, which was seen not just as religious preference, but as a social and political rejection of Rome itself. Chinese letter meetings were misconstrued as illicit, and their talk of a coming kingdom was easily twisted into sedition. They were the perfect target. What followed was not merely a political maneuver, but a campaign of horrific, state-sanctioned brutality. Tacitus, who held no particular fondness for the Christians, described the persecutions with chilling detail. They were arrested in great numbers, not on evidence of arson, but on the charge of hatred of the human race. Their executions were designed as public spectacles of utter cruelty, intended to entertain a bloodthirsty mob and serve as a grim warning. Some were sewn into the skins of wild animals and torn apart by dogs in the arena. Others were covered in pitch, impaled on stakes, and set ablaze to serve as human torches, illuminating Nero's gardens during evening games. The emperor himself reportedly mingled with the crowd, dressed as a charioteer, and took in the gruesome sights. The motive was a cold political calculus. By directing the people's rage toward a vulnerable minority, Nero could reclaim his damaged authority and proceed with his grand vision, the rebuilding of Rome. He seized the vast tracts of charred land to construct his magnificent Domus Aurea, his golden house, a sprawling palace complex that stood as a monument to his own ego, complete with a colossal bronze statue of himself 120 feet tall. The immediate impact was the near annihilation of the Christian community in Rome, but the long-term consequences were paradoxically opposite to Nero's intentions. The sheer brutality of the persecution, so vividly documented, created the faith's first martyrs. Their courage in the face of horrific death became a powerful testament, lending a moral authority and a narrative of sacrifice that would ultimately strengthen the very movement he sought to crush. This decision cemented a template for persecution that would be revisited for centuries, defining the tense and often bloody relationship between the Roman state and the growing Christian church. It stands as one of history's most stark examples of how a leader's desperate attempt to consolidate power can unleash unimaginable suffering, all while inadvertently shaping the very future they hope to suppress. From the chaotic ashes of Rome, we journey back in time over a millennium to the sun-baked banks of the Nile, to a decision so radical it threatened to tear the very soul from ancient Egypt. Here, a pharaoh chose not to scapegoat a minority, but to dismantle the entire spiritual foundation of one of history's most stable and enduring civilizations. This is the story of Pharaoh Akhenaten and his audacious monotheistic revolution. Imagine the weight of 1,400 years of tradition. For over a millennium, Egyptian society had been meticulously structured around a complex and forgiving pantheon of gods. From the mighty Ammon to the protective Isis, these deities were woven into the fabric of daily life, commerce, and the absolute authority of the pharaoh. The temples were not just places of worship, they were economic powerhouses, administrative centers, and the beating heart of the community, employing thousands from priests to artisans to farmers. To challenge this system was to risk everything, and yet that is precisely what Akhenaten did. Early in his reign, he began a theological overhaul so complete it stunned his subjects. He declared the sun disk, known as the Aten, was not merely a new chief god, but the one and only true deity. This was not simple religious preference, it was a state-enforced mandate of monotheism, a concept virtually unheard of in the ancient world. Akhenaten's revolution was executed with a startling and systematic thoroughness. He didn't just promote the Aten, he actively worked to erase the old gods from existence. He sent crews across the kingdom to chisel the names and images of Ammon and other major deities from temple walls, attempting to literally delete them from history. The powerful priesthood of Ammon, which had rivaled the pharaoh's own influence, was effectively dismantled as their temples were closed and their revenue streams diverted to the crown. To physically cement this break from the past, Akhenaten abandoned the ancient capital of Thebes, the city of Ammon, and ordered the construction of an entirely new capital city, Akhenaten, meaning the horizon of the Aten, at a site we now call Amarna. Built in breakneck speed, this city was a monument to the new god and his prophet, the pharaoh himself. Art and architecture were transformed overnight, shifting from idealized, formal depictions of gods and pharaohs to a startling, almost distorted naturalism, focused intensely on the royal family bathed in the rays of the Aten. The immediate consequences of this decision were catastrophic for the Egyptian state and its people. The economic turmoil was immense. By shutting down the traditional temples, Akhenaten disrupted a vast network of trade, distribution, and employment, plunging the economy into a downward spiral. Social unrest simmered as the people were cut off from the gods they had prayed to for generations for healing, fertility, and protection in the afterlife. Foreign policy crumbled as Akhenaten became increasingly obsessed with his theological project. Letters from desperate vassal states and allies went unanswered, and Egyptian influence in its empire withered. The pharaoh, in his isolated capital, seemed to care little for anything beyond the worship of his sole god. Unsurprisingly, such a radical upheaval could not outlive its architect. Upon Akhenaten's death, the backlash was swift and severe. His name was added to the official lists of illegitimate rulers, his city was abandoned to the desert sands, and the traditional pantheon was restored with a vengeance. His immediate successor, the boy King Tutankhamun, who was likely his son, didn't just reverse these policies, he explicitly condemned them in a famous decree, stating that the gods had turned their backs on Egypt due to Akhenaten's heresy and that the temples lay in ruin. The systematic effort to expunge Akhenaten from history was so successful that he remained a forgotten pharaoh for over 3,000 years. His decision stands as a breathtaking lesson in the limits of power. Even an absolute monarch, believed to be a god on earth, could not force a fundamental change of belief upon his entire people without triggering economic collapse, social chaos, and a legacy of hatred so complete that his very existence would be erased for millennia. Leaving behind the theological upheaval in Egypt, we travel north to the arid plains of Anatolia, to a kingdom synonymous with unimaginable wealth and a king whose name would become a proverb for fortune itself. This is the story of King Croesus of Lydia and his catastrophic decision to wage war against an emerging superpower, a choice born not from clear strategic advantage, but from a fatal misinterpretation of divine will. Croesus ruled Lydia at its zenith. His realm was fabulously wealthy, thanks to the gold-rich sands of the river Pactolus and his innovation of minting the world's first standardized gold and silver coins, which revolutionized trade. He was so rich that the phrase, "as rich as Croesus," persists to this day. Yet this immense wealth bred a towering confidence, a hubris that would cloud his judgment. To his east, the Persian Empire was rapidly expanding under the brilliant and ambitious Cyrus the Great. Watching Cyrus topple rival kingdoms, Croesus grew anxious. He saw a potential threat and, perhaps driven by a desire for even greater glory, contemplated a preemptive strike. But this was not a decision to be made lightly. In the ancient world, one did not go to war without first consulting the gods. So Croesus sent lavishly generous offerings, ingots of gold, statues of lions, and countless other treasures, to the most renowned oracle in the known world, the Oracle of Delphi in Greece. His question was direct: should he march against Persia? The oracle's reply was famously cryptic. It declared that if Croesus attacked the Persians, he would destroy a great empire. Elated and hearing only what he wanted to hear, Croesus interpreted this as a guaranteed prophecy of his victory. He failed to consider the terrifying possibility that the great empire to be destroyed might be his own. Bolstered by this divine assurance, he forged his alliance with Sparta, Egypt, and Babylon, and confidently crossed the Halys River into Persian territory in 546 BC. The campaign was a disaster from the start. A fierce but inconclusive battle at Tyria ended with both sides retreating. Assuming the fighting season was over, Croesus made his second critical error. He disbanded his expensive mercenary army and returned to his capital at Sardis, expecting Cyrus to do the same and resume hostilities in the spring. But Cyrus was a commander of a different caliber. He did not play by the conventional rules of warfare. In a stunning and unexpected maneuver, he pursued Croesus deep into Lydia, showing up at the gates of Sardis before the Lydian king could reassemble his forces. The ensuing Battle of Sardis was swift. The Lydians' famed cavalry was thrown into disarray when Cyrus, in a moment of tactical genius, ordered his camels to be placed at the front of his lines. The unfamiliar sight and smell of the camels spooked the Lydian horses, rendering their greatest military advantage useless. The city fell after a brief siege. The irony of the Delphic prophecy was now horrifyingly clear. By attacking Persia, Croesus had indeed destroyed a great empire his own. The wealthy, powerful kingdom of Lydia was no more, absorbed into the vast Persian Empire. According to the historian Herodotus, Cyrus ordered Croesus to be burned alive on a great pyre. As the flames licked higher, the defeated king supposedly cried out the name of the sage Solon, who had once warned him that no man could be judged happy until his life was over. Hearing this, Cyrus, intrigued by such wisdom and perhaps moved by the spectacle of a once great king brought so low, ordered the flames to be extinguished. Croesus was spared and, legend says, even became an advisor to the Persian king. Croesus's decision serves as an eternal lesson in the dangers of pride and the perils of hearing only what we wish to hear. His story is a masterclass in how confirmation bias can lead even the most powerful individuals to catastrophic failure. He sought a divine guarantee and received instead a riddle, one whose true meaning was only revealed in the ashes of his defeat. It reminds us that in the ancient world, the gods spoke in puzzles, and a leader's greatest weakness was often not a lack of resources, but a surplus of arrogance. If the tale of Croesus is a lesson in misreading divine signs, our next story descends into a realm where a leader believed he could command the gods themselves. We now turn to one of history's most bizarre and chillingly symbolic acts of madness, Emperor Caligula's declaration of war on the sea. This was not a simple temper tantrum. It was a meticulously staged piece of political theater that revealed a mind rapidly unraveling and a regime built on terror beginning to crack at its foundations. The seeds of this surreal event were sown during Caligula's planned invasion of Britain in 40 AD. He had assembled a massive force on the coast of Gaul, a powerful army and fleet poised to bring a new province into the Roman fold and grant its young emperor the military glory he so desperately craved. But then something happened. The ancient sources, particularly Suetonius, are murky on the precise details. Some suggest his troops, aware of his instability, mutinied, refusing to cross the treacherous English Channel. Others report that Caligula himself simply lost his nerve at the last moment, staring out at the vast, unpredictable ocean and feeling a terror he could not overcome. Whatever the true catalyst, the invasion was abruptly called off. For a Roman emperor, especially one whose hold on power relied heavily on the loyalty of the legions, this was a monumental public humiliation. He could not return to Rome empty-handed. He needed a victory, or at the very least, a spectacle that would reframe his failure as triumph. His solution was as brilliant as it was insane. He ordered his entire army to form a battle line on the beach, facing the waves. Trumpets sounded the attack, and he commanded his soldiers to advance into the water, stabbing at the surf with their swords and spears and firing their slings and arrows into the open sea. They were to pillage the ocean as if it were a conquered enemy territory. When this battle was won, Caligula declared a decisive victory over the ocean itself, personified as the god Neptune. And every conquest requires spoils. He then ordered his thoroughly bewildered and likely humiliated soldiers to gather seashells from the shore, meticulously collecting them in their helmets and the folds of their tunics. These shells, he proclaimed, were the treasures of the sea, the plunder won from the defeated god. He would parade them through the streets of Rome as proof of his great victory. To dismiss this as mere childishness or the simple raving of a madman is to miss its profound political and psychological danger. This act was a deliberate and terrifying abuse of absolute power. It was a message not to the ocean but to every senator, soldier, and citizen in the empire. Caligula was demonstrating that his will was so absolute, so boundless, that he could even command nature and defy the gods. He could force the world to conform to his own distorted reality. If he said the ocean was an enemy that had been defeated, then it was so. If he said seashells were valuable spoils of war, then they were to be treated as gold and silver. This was the logic of a tyrant who believed himself to be a living god, answerable to no one and nothing, not even the laws of nature. the immediate consequences were devastating to the remnants of his authority. The military, the bedrock of imperial power, was profoundly alienated. These were hardened legionaries, men who prided themselves on discipline and real conquest. Being forced to stage a mock battle and collect seashells as spoils was a deep and unforgivable insult to their dignity and their very identity. The political elite in Rome, already living in fear of his erratic purges and executions, saw this act as final, incontrovertible proof that the emperor was no longer merely cruel or eccentric, but dangerously detached from reality. He had moved beyond being a political threat. He had become an existential one to the stability of the state itself. This symbolic war on Neptune did not cause Caligula's assassination the following year, but it perfectly illustrates the climate of fear, absurdity, and contempt that made his murder not just inevitable, but necessary in the eyes of those who carried it out. It stands as a timeless warning of what happens when power is divorced from reality, and a leader's inner madness becomes the governing force of an entire nation. From the tyrannical theater of Rome, we journey further east to a different kind of consolidation of power, one not of chaotic madness, but of chilling, systematic control. In the wake of unifying China's warring states into a single empire for the first time in history, the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, faced a monumental challenge: how to govern this vast new territory and ensure his revolutionary vision for China would last forever. His answer was a philosophy of absolute state power known as legalism, a system that prized order, obedience, and punishment above all else. But to create a unified state, he believed he first had to unify thought itself, leading to one of history's most infamous campaigns against knowledge and intellectual freedom: the burning of books and the burying of scholars. Qin Shi Huang and his ruthless advisor, Lai Si, argued that the source of division and dissent in the former states lay in the minds of the people, minds that were filled with the competing philosophies of the past. Confucians looked to ancient rites and moral examples to guide society. Taoists sought harmony with the natural way, but these diverse schools of thought, in the legalist view, encouraged people to criticize the government and look backward to a fractured past rather than forward to a unified future under the emperor's law. To cure this disease of dissent, Lai Si prescribed a radical treatment, a cultural reset. He proposed that all historical records not held by the state's official archivists be burned. All poetry, all philosophical texts, especially those of Confucius, and any writings that praised ancient times or challenged the legalist doctrine of the Qin state were to be confiscated and set ablaze. The emperor agreed, and the decree was issued around 213 BC. The order was terrifyingly specific. Private citizens were given a 30-day deadline to turn over their forbidden books to local authorities to be burned. The only texts spared were practical manuals on agriculture, medicine, prophecy, and forestry works that had immediate utilitarian value for the state. To possess a forbidden text after the deadline was punishable by death. To discuss ancient poetry or philosophy in public was punishable by execution. To use the past to criticize the present was a crime that could see an entire family exterminated. The goal was not just to destroy physical objects, but to sever the people's connection to any ideology other than the state's, creating a population that knew only the law of the emperor. But the burning of books was only half the story, leading to the even more sinister event that gives this policy its infamous name: the burying of scholars. According to the grand historian Sima Qian, the emperor later discovered that some scholars were secretly evading his orders, hiding texts, and privately criticizing his regime. His response was swift and brutal. He ordered over 400 scholars to be arrested. Their fate, as recorded, was to be taken to his capital, Xianyang, where they were buried alive in a pit. Some accounts suggest he also had others executed or sent to work on his massive construction projects, like the early stages of what would become the Great Wall. Whether the live burial was a single event or a prolonged campaign of terror, its message was unmistakable. Dissent would be literally buried, and intellectual resistance would be met with the most horrific and symbolic of punishments. The immediate cultural and historical devastation is almost impossible to overstate. Countless unique historical chronicles from the various conquered states were lost forever, erasing vast swaths of China's early history and cultural diversity. Philosophical traditions were critically damaged, their lineages of teaching broken. The emperor sought to be the only source of history, the only font of wisdom, the singular architect of reality. In the short term, he succeeded in imposing a terrifying silence, but this tyranny planted the very seeds of his dynasty's destruction. The immense resentment from the educated elite and the common people alike, who saw their cultural heritage annihilated, festered beneath the surface. The Qin dynasty's rule was so dependent on fear and brutality that it could not survive the death of its founder. Immediately after Qin Shi Huang died, revolts erupted everywhere. The very scholars and intellectuals he had tried to eradicate joined forces with rebels, and within just 4 years, his dynasty had crumbled into ash, much like the books he had burned. The Han dynasty that followed made a point of repealing these laws, desperately trying to reconstruct the lost texts from memory and hidden caches. Qin Shi Huang's mausoleum, guarded by his terracotta army, stands as a monument to his power, but his policy of destroying knowledge stands as a far more lasting testament to the futility of trying to erase ideas. It demonstrates a paradox that tyrants throughout history have learned too late. You can kill scholars and burn books, but you cannot kill the desire for knowledge. In fact, the very act of suppression often ensures that the memory of what was lost and the hatred for the one who destroyed it becomes the engine of your own downfall. Leaving behind the smoldering libraries of ancient China, we now venture west to the sun-scorched battlefields of the Mediterranean, where a different kind of fire burned, the all-consuming ambition of a general who would stop at nothing to bring a republic to its knees. Our next controversial decision is a masterclass in audacity, a move so breathtakingly bold that it has echoed through military history for over 2 millennia. Hannibal Barca's decision to cross the Alps with his army and his war elephants to invade the Roman heartland. The year was 218 BC. The Second Punic War had just begun, and Hannibal, the young Carthaginian commander, was in Spain. The Romans, expecting a conventional war fought across the sea, planned to meet him in Iberia and even launch an assault on Carthage itself in North Africa. But Hannibal refused to play by their rules. His strategy was psychological as much as it was military. He knew that to truly defeat Rome, he had to break its spirit, to shatter its sense of invulnerability by bringing the horror of war directly to its doorstep. This meant taking the fight to Italy, but the sea routes were heavily patrolled by the powerful Roman navy. The only other way was by land, a journey that meant marching an army of 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 African forest elephants through the hostile, snow-choked passes of the Alps, a feat considered utterly impossible. The journey itself was a relentless nightmare, a brutal slog against nature and man. The army first had to cross the Pyrenees and then the Rhone River, where they faced skirmishes with local Gallic tribes. But the Alps were a different order of magnitude altogether. The narrow, icy paths were barely wide enough for a single man, let alone a massive column of soldiers and panicked massive animals. Avalanches were a constant threat, with entire sections of the path and the soldiers on it swept away without warning. The freezing cold, for which his North African and Spanish troops were utterly unprepared, claimed countless lives. Perhaps most dangerously, the mountain tribes, the Allobroges, saw the struggling army not as a threat but as a target-rich environment. They launched constant ambushes from the high cliffs above, rolling boulders down onto the column below, picking off stragglers and stealing precious supplies. The Carthaginians were fighting a war on 2 fronts, against the landscape itself and against its fierce inhabitants. The cost was staggering. By the time Hannibal's emaciated and exhausted force finally descended into the fertile plains of northern Italy after just 15 days, his army had been gutted. Ancient sources, likely exaggerated but still indicative of catastrophic loss, suggest he arrived with only 20,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, and a mere handful of his original 37 elephants. He had lost well over half of his fighting force not in glorious battle, but to the indifferent cruelty of the mountains. This is the core of the controversy that still divides historians today. Was this crossing a work of strategic genius, or was it a catastrophic blunder that crippled his campaign before it even truly began? The argument for strategic mastery is powerful. Hannibal achieved complete strategic surprise. The Romans were utterly stunned to find a Carthaginian army, complete with mythical elephants, materializing in their backyard. This unexpected invasion forced them to abandon their own plans and scramble to defend their homeland, immediately giving Hannibal the initiative. The sheer psychological impact of his arrival cannot be overstated. It made him seem invincible, a commander who could overcome any obstacle, which helped him win over many hesitant Gallic tribes in northern Italy to his cause, swelling his ranks with fresh recruits. Most importantly, it set the stage for his subsequent legendary victories at the Trebia and Lake Trasimene, and ultimately his masterpiece at Cannae, where he annihilated a Roman army twice the size of his own. Without the Alpine crossing, there is no Cannae. Yet, the argument that it was a disastrous gamble holds significant weight. The losses were so profound that Hannibal never possessed the manpower necessary to actually lay siege to the city of Rome itself. He could defeat Roman armies in the field repeatedly, but he lacked the numbers and the equipment to storm its massive walls. This fundamental shortcoming, a direct result of the Alpine attrition, created a strategic dead end. He could win battles, but not the war. He was forced to spend over a decade marauding through the Italian countryside, his army gradually weakening while the Romans, under the brilliant strategy of Fabius Maximus, simply avoided another major engagement and slowly strangled his supply line. The Alpine crossing, for all its audacity, left him like a bee that could sting but not kill, ultimately leading to a long, drawn-out war of attrition that Carthage was destined to lose. So, was it genius or folly? The truth lies in the uncomfortable space between the two. It was undoubtedly one of the most daring military operations in history, a testament to Hannibal's unparalleled leadership and the incredible endurance of his men. It delivered a shock to the Roman system that it would never forget. But it was also a desperate, high-stakes gamble that came at an enormous and ultimately unsustainable cost. Hannibal bet everything on a knockout blow, and while he landed several stunning punches, the Alpine crossing ensured he could never deliver the final one. His decision remains the ultimate example of a high-reward, high-risk strategy, a breathtaking success that somehow also contained the seeds of its own eventual defeat. From the icy, treacherous peaks that challenged Hannibal, we now sail to the warm, turbulent waters of the Mediterranean, where a queen gambled her entire kingdom on the heart of a Roman general. This is the story of Cleopatra VII, the last active pharaoh of Ptolemaic Egypt, and her fateful decision to bind her destiny, and that of her ancient, wealthy nation, to Mark Antony in his struggle for supremacy against Octavian. This was not merely a political alliance, it was a grand, dramatic fusion of power and passion that would culminate in a naval catastrophe and forever extinguish the line of the pharaohs. Following the assassination of Julius Caesar, the Roman world was fractured. The second triumvirate, Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus, had defeated Caesar's assassins but was already crumbling from within, a partnership of rivals destined to tear itself apart. Cleopatra, a ruler of immense intellect and political savvy, understood that Egypt's survival depended on navigating this Roman civil war. She had already successfully allied herself with Julius Caesar, securing her throne and bearing him a son, Caesarion, a living symbol of a fused Roman-Egyptian lineage. When Mark Antony, as the ruler of Rome's eastern provinces, summoned her to Tarsus to answer for her alleged support of his enemies, she did not go as a supplicant. She arrived as a goddess. Her famous entry on a golden barge dressed as Venus was a masterstroke of political theater, designed to meet Antony on a level of divine spectacle, not subservience. Their connection was instant and profound, a partnership that would evolve into a deep romantic and political union. Cleopatra's decision to fully commit to Antony was a calculated risk of breathtaking proportions. She provided him with the vast wealth of Egypt, hundreds of thousands of tons of grain, money to pay his legions, and the formidable Egyptian fleet to fund his military campaigns, first against Parthia and ultimately against his fellow triumvir Octavian. In return, Antony made grand, shocking gestures that alienated the Roman political class. At the donations of Alexandria, he declared Cleopatra the Queen of Kings and her son Caesarion the King of Kings, distributing Roman-controlled territories in the east to her and their children. To Octavian's propagandists in Rome, this was a nightmare scenario. A Roman general, seemingly bewitched by an Eastern queen, was giving away the spoils of Roman conquest to his foreign lover and their illegitimate heirs. Octavian skillfully spun this narrative, portraying Antony as a man who had lost his Roman virtue, a traitor under the thumb of a decadent, scheming monarch. The final, inevitable confrontation came at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. Octavian's fleet, commanded by the brilliant Agrippa, blockaded Antony and Cleopatra's larger combined force in the Gulf of Ambracia. The traditional view is of a grand, decisive naval battle, but many historians now see it as a fraught and confused engagement. Agrippa's strategy was one of attrition, using his more maneuverable ships to pick at Antony's lines, avoiding a full-scale melee. The crucial moment came when Cleopatra, stationed behind Antony's line with her 60 Egyptian ships, suddenly raised sail and broke through the center of the ongoing fight. Antony, seeing her depart, abandoned his own flagship, transferred to a faster vessel, and followed her. The rest of his fleet, leaderless and confused, was left to be systematically captured or destroyed. The motives behind this infamous flight have been debated for centuries. Was it a prearranged plan that went awry, a cowardly abandonment by a lovesick general, or a desperate, last-ditch attempt to salvage their most valuable assets themselves and the Egyptian treasury to fight another day? Regardless of the intent, the perception was catastrophic. It looked like Antony had forsaken his loyal men to run after his queen, and Cleopatra had cut and run at the first sign of trouble. Their force was shattered and their reputations were in ruins. They retreated to Alexandria, their power evaporating with every passing day as Octavian's army advanced unchallenged. The consequence of Cleopatra's choice was the absolute end of an era. With Octavian's legions at the gates of Alexandria, Mark Antony, hearing a false report of Cleopatra's death, fell on his sword. The queen herself was captured, but she had one final, devastatingly personal decision to make. Faced with the prospect of being paraded through the streets of Rome in Octavian's triumph as a conquered trophy, she chose to take her own life. According to legend, she did so by the bite of an asp, a sacred Egyptian symbol of divine royalty, thus dying as a pharaoh on her own terms rather than living as a prisoner. Octavian, now Augustus, had Caesarion hunted down and killed, eliminating any rival claimant to Julius Caesar's name. Egypt, the breadbasket of the Mediterranean and the last surviving Hellenistic kingdom, was annexed as a personal province of the Roman emperor, its vast wealth funding the new Roman Empire. Cleopatra's gamble was for the highest of stakes, the mastery of the entire Roman world. In losing, she secured not just her own legend but also the final, complete ascendancy of Rome, closing the book on 3,000 years of pharaonic rule and opening a new chapter in world history under the unchallenged power of Augustus. If the reign of Caligula demonstrated how madness could unravel an emperor, The story of Elagabalus shows how a radical cultural and religious vision could provoke a backlash so violent it sought to erase a ruler from history itself. Following the chaos and assassination of Caligula, the imperial throne was seized by Macrinus, a man not of the Severan dynasty. The powerful women of the Severan family, particularly Julia Misa, would not stand for this. She concocted a breathtakingly audacious plan, proclaiming her 14-year-old grandson, Varius Avitus Bassianus, was the secret illegitimate son of the murdered Caligula. The boy, who served as the high priest of the Syrian sun god Elagabal in the city of Emesa, was thrust onto the world stage. His name would become synonymous with decadence and controversy, but his actions were far more calculated and far more revolutionary than simple debauchery. Upon arriving in Rome, the young emperor, now known to history as Elagabalus, did not attempt to assimilate. Instead, he embarked on a deliberate and systematic project to transform the very heart of Roman identity. At the core of this project was his religion. He did not merely introduce a new god to the already crowded Roman pantheon. He sought to dethrone Jupiter Optimus Maximus himself, the king of the gods and the symbolic bedrock of the Roman state for centuries. He had the sacred black stone, the conical meteorite that was the embodiment of the god Elagabal, transported from Syria with immense ceremony and installed in a lavish new temple on the Palatine Hill, the Elagabalium. This was an intentional act of theological supremacy. He demanded that the symbols of Rome's most revered deities, Jupiter, Juno, Minerva, and even Vesta, be brought to his new temple and placed in a subordinate position to his sun god. He declared that all other gods were merely servants of Elagabal. For the Roman elite, this wasn't just religious innovation, it was sacrilege on an unprecedented scale, a direct assault on the Pax Deorum, the sacred peace between Rome and its gods that guaranteed the empire's prosperity. His personal life became the vehicle for his cultural revolution, and nothing caused more outrage than his approach to marriage and gender. His most infamous act was his marriage to the Vestal virgin Aquilia Severa. The Vestals were the most sacred figures in Roman religion, priestesses sworn to 30 years of chastity on pain of being buried alive. For an emperor to marry one was not just a scandal, it was an unforgivable violation of divine law that threatened to bring a curse upon the entire city. For Elagabalus, however, this union was likely deeply symbolic, a merging of the old Roman sacred order with his new Syrian solar deity, creating a potent, world-renewing partnership. His behavior consistently challenged rigid Roman gender norms. Ancient sources, though hostile, describe his preference for being called lady instead of lord, his offer of vast sums to any physician who could equip him with female anatomy, and his open relationships with men, including a charioteer he referred to as his husband. He hosted lavish banquets where he would shock guests by appearing in elaborate makeup and feminine silks, assigning guests thematic roles and serving food made of precious materials or exotic animals. To traditional Romans, this was not just eccentricity, it was a dangerous inversion of the natural order, a spectacle of Eastern decadence corrupting Roman virtus, the manly virtue that defined their ideal of strength. The Senate and the Praetorian Guard, the twin pillars of imperial power, watched with mounting horror and disgust each new outrage, from his marriages to a Vestal and then to a man he called his husband, to his reported prostitution of himself in the imperial palace, was another crack in the foundation of his authority. He was not just an embarrassment, he was seen as an active threat to the stability of the state and the favor of the gods. His grandmother, Julia Misa, who had engineered his rise, saw the writing on the wall. She realized her other grandson, the more conventional and acceptable Severus Alexander, was a far safer bet for the dynasty's survival. She likely facilitated, or at least did nothing to prevent, the plot that was forming. After just 4 years of rule, the Praetorian Guard, the very force that had brought him to power, turned on him. They murdered the 18-year-old emperor and his mother in a latrine where they had tried to hide. His body was dragged through the streets of Rome, dumped into the Tiber River, and subjected to damnatio memoriae, the official condemnation of memory. His name was chiseled from public inscriptions, his images defaced, and his religious reforms immediately reversed. The Black Stone of Elagabal was sent back to Syria. The Senate and the military had reasserted control, violently purging what they saw as a foreign, heretical infection from the body politic. Elagabalus's reign stands as a stark lesson in the limits of cultural tolerance, even in a vast multicultural empire. It demonstrates that a ruler's power, however absolute, could shatter upon the rocks of deep-seated tradition and religious conservatism when pushed too far, too fast. From the decadent and chaotic court of Elagabalus in Rome, we travel even further back in time to the opulent, seemingly impregnable city of Babylon, where the echoes of a feast would herald the end of an empire. Our next controversial decision unfolds not on a battlefield, but in a banquet hall, where a king's arrogant defiance during a moment of existential crisis serves as a timeless lesson in hubris. This is the story of King Belshazzar's feast, a tale immortalized in the Book of Daniel and corroborated by the ancient chronicles of Herodotus and the Cyrus Cylinder. The year is 539 BC. Outside the massive, towering walls of Babylon, the forces of Cyrus the Great, the brilliant architect of the Persian Empire, have laid siege. The city was legendary for its defenses, impossibly high walls so wide that chariots could race along the top, and the mighty Euphrates River flowing directly through its center, providing both a water source and a natural moat. By all accounts, Babylon was unconquerable. It could withstand a siege for years. Inside these walls, the co-regent King Belshazzar, grandson of the great Nebuchadnezzar, felt utterly secure. Perhaps it was this false sense of security, or perhaps a deep-seated arrogance, that led him to make a decision of profound and reckless provocation. He decided to throw a lavish, massive feast for 1,000 of his nobles. This was not merely a gathering to boost morale. As the wine flowed, Belshazzar's audacity grew. In a move intended to display his absolute power and contempt for any god but his own, he gave a command that would seal his fate. He ordered that the sacred gold and silver vessels, which his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar had looted from the Temple of Jerusalem decades earlier, be brought to the banquet hall. These were not just trophies of war, they were objects consecrated for the worship of the God of Israel, considered so holy that only specific priests could even handle them. To the stunned horror of any Jewish exiles present, Belshazzar and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines drank wine from these sacred cups, toasting and praising the gods of Babylon, gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone. He was using the most sacred relics of a conquered people as common party goblets, actively mocking a deity whose power he clearly believed was broken. It was in the midst of this sacrilegious revelry that the inexplicable occurred. According to the biblical account, the fingers of a human hand suddenly appeared opposite a lampstand and began writing on the plaster of the palace wall. The king watched as this disembodied hand inscribed words in a language no one could understand. The music stopped, the laughter died, the color drained from Belshazzar's face, his knees knocked together in terror. He called frantically for his wise men, the enchanters, astrologers, and diviners, promising royal purple cloth, a gold chain, and the position of third highest ruler in the kingdom to anyone who could read the writing and interpret it. But none of the king's wise men could understand the message. The words remained a terrifying mystery. It was the Queen Mother who remembered a man of exceptional wisdom from the days of Nebuchadnezzar. She urged Belshazzar to send for Daniel, a Jewish exile renowned for his ability to interpret dreams and solve mysteries. Daniel was brought before the terrified king. He was offered the rewards, but he refused them. He first reminded Belshazzar of the lesson of his grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar. who had been driven insane and lived like a beast for 7 years until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over all kingdoms. Then Daniel delivered his stunning interpretation. The words on the wall were mean, tekel, upharsin. This is the interpretation, Daniel declared. Mean, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Upharsin, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. That very night, even as the feast's aftermath was being cleared away, the prophecy was fulfilled with breathtaking speed. While Belshazzar had been feasting, Cyrus was executing one of the most ingenious military maneuvers in history. Herodotus records that the Persians, unable to breach the walls, diverted the flow of the Euphrates River into a nearby swamp, causing the water level flowing through the city to drop to the height of a man's thigh. Persian soldiers then waded silently up the riverbed, entering the city through the underwater gates that had been left unguarded, likely because the entire city was distracted by Belshazzar's great festival. They met little resistance. The Greek historian Xenophon adds that the Babylonians were so confident in their walls that they were holding a great festival themselves that very night, with the entire population, including the king, engaged in dancing and celebration. The Persian forces moved through the city and stormed the palace. According to the Book of Daniel, Belshazzar was killed that night. The ancient Nabonidus Chronicle, a contemporary Babylonian text, confirms that Babylon fell without a battle and that Ugbaru, the governor of Gutium, entered the city on the 16th of the month Tashritu, with Cyrus himself making a triumphant entry days later. Belshazzar's decision to host that feast and profane the sacred vessels was the culmination of a leadership defined by arrogance and a fatal disconnect from reality. While his city was under siege, he was indulging in a spectacle of mockery. He believed his walls and his gods made him invincible, but his true weakness was a spiritual and moral blindness. His story is a powerful archetype of divine retribution, but it is also a starkly practical lesson for any leader. It teaches that no amount of wealth or military might can protect a kingdom whose ruler, in a moment of crisis, chooses prideful celebration over vigilant leadership and who shows contempt for the deeply held beliefs of others. The writing was not just on the wall for Belshazzar. It was a message for the ages declaring that every empire, no matter how glorious, can be weighed, measured, and found wanting in an instant. While the fall of Babylon was a dramatic collapse fueled by arrogance, our next controversial decision represents a different kind of ending, not of an empire but of an entire intellectual tradition. We now travel to the 6th century AD, to the waning years of the classical world, where the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I made a choice that would echo through the halls of academia for 1,000 years, the permanent closure of Plato's Academy in Athens. For nearly 900 years, the Academy had stood as the beating heart of philosophical inquiry in the ancient world. Founded by Plato around 387 BC, it was more than just a school. It was a living institution, a continuous line of scholarly succession where generations of thinkers had debated the nature of reality, ethics, mathematics, and the cosmos. By Justinian's time, the Academy was the last major bastion of pagan philosophical thought in an empire that had been officially Christian for over 2 centuries. The scholars there were the intellectual heirs of Plato and Aristotle, dedicated to preserving and debating classical knowledge. They were not a threat to the state in any military sense, but they represented a competing vision of truth, one based on reason and dialectic, rather than religious doctrine and revelation. Justinian was an emperor of immense ambition and fervent religious conviction. His reign was defined by 2 colossal projects: the reconquest of lost Western territories from barbarian kingdoms and the monumental codification of Roman law known as the Corpus Juris Civilis. A third, equally powerful drive was his campaign to enforce religious uniformity and orthodoxy across his empire. He saw religious dissent not just as a spiritual error, but as a threat to the political and social unity of the realm. In 529 AD, as part of a broader series of edicts aimed at rooting out paganism, heresy, and other non-Christian practices, Justinian issued the order to close the academy. He cut off all state funding and forbade pagans from teaching altogether, effectively strangling the institution that had operated for centuries. The immediate impact was the dispersal of the remaining scholars. According to the historian Agathias, 7 of the Academy's leading philosophers, including the renowned scholarch Damasius, faced a stark choice: conform to Christianity or lose their livelihood. Refusing to compromise their beliefs, they chose exile. In one of history's great ironies, they sought refuge in the very same place many saw as the antithesis of the enlightened Greek world, the court of the Persian Sassanid king Khosrow I. Khosrow, an unusually philosophically minded monarch, welcomed them into his court at Ctesiphon. However, the philosophers soon found the Persian culture and Zoroastrian religious environment alien and unsatisfactory. A clause in a peace treaty Justinian later signed with Khosrow even guaranteed their safe return and allowed them to live out their days in the Byzantine Empire without fear of persecution, a testament to their enduring prestige. But the damage was done. The school itself was gone, its property likely confiscated, its formal teaching lineage broken forever. To view this decision merely as the shuttering of one school, however, is to miss its profound symbolic and long-term consequences. It was the final, official severing of the Byzantine Empire from its pagan philosophical roots. While learning certainly continued, the Byzantine world would preserve countless ancient texts and produce its own scholars. The kind of open, secular, philosophical inquiry that characterized the academy was effectively ended. The focus of education shifted overwhelmingly toward theology, law, and rhetoric in service of the Christian state. The closure did not, as some older histories claimed, single-handedly cause the Dark Ages, but it was a significant part of a broader cultural shift where independent philosophical speculation became increasingly marginalized in the Greek-speaking world. The long-term legacy is complex. The dispersal of scholars may have actually helped preserve some texts and ideas as they carried their knowledge with them. But the extinguishing of the academy as an institution created a vacuum. The vibrant, critical tradition of Athenian philosophy, which had challenged and refined ideas for centuries, faded away, leaving a more theologically constrained intellectual landscape in its wake. Justinian's decision was driven by a desire for religious purity and imperial unity, but it came at a tremendous cost to the diversity of thought. It stands as a poignant milestone in the transition from the classical world to the medieval era, a moment where faith officially triumphed over a particular kind of reason, and the doors of the world's first university were closed for the final time. If the closing of the academy was an attack on reason itself, our next decision presents a confrontation with nature so outrageous it has become the very definition of hubris. We journey now to the windswept shores of the Hellespont in 480 BC, where the King of Kings, Xerxes I of Persia, prepared to launch the largest invasion force the ancient world had ever seen against the fractious city-states of Greece. His ambition was to succeed where his father, Darius, had failed at Marathon, and to finally incorporate all of Greece into his vast empire. The logistical challenge was immense. To move his army, which Herodotus claims numbered over 2 million men, a certainly exaggerated but still indicative figure of a colossal host, he needed to cross the narrow strait separating Asia from Europe. His engineers achieved the seemingly impossible, constructing not one but 2 magnificent pontoon bridges by lashing together hundreds of ships side by side and anchoring them with massive ropes of papyrus and flax, creating a road across the sea. Then the unpredictable fury of the sea intervened. A violent storm, common in those narrow waters, rose up and smashed the engineering marvel to splinters, scattering the precious materials and undoing months of work. For a normal commander, this would be a devastating setback, a simple act of bad luck from an indifferent nature. But Xerxes was no normal commander. He was the great king, the Shahanshah, a man who believed his will was law not just for his subjects but for the entire natural order. In a fit of towering rage, he interpreted the storm not as a random meteorological event, but as a personal insult from the sea itself, a direct challenge to his divine authority. His response was as irrational as it was legendary. He ordered his men to administer 300 lashes to the waters of the Hellespont with whips, to brand it with hot irons as one would a slave, and to lower a pair of shackles into the waves as a symbol of its imprisonment. He even commanded his executioners to shout insults at the water as they carried out their punishment, declaring it a turbid and bitter river whose master would cross it regardless of its defiance. This was not merely the tantrum of a spoiled monarch. In the symbolic language of ancient Near Eastern kingship, it was a calculated, terrifying piece of political theater. By punishing the sea, Xerxes was demonstrating his absolute power to his massive, multi-ethnic army. He was showing them that even the forces of nature itself would be subdued and humiliated if they dared to oppose his will. For his Persian subjects raised on the ideology of absolute monarchy, this might have reinforced his godlike status, but for the countless Greek mercenaries and allies in his force, and for the observing Ionian Greeks who knew the sea as the domain of Poseidon, this act was not impressive, it was deeply blasphemous and unhinged. It revealed a megalomania so profound that it saw the entire world as a subject to be disciplined, a hubris that offended both mortal sensibilities and, they believed, the gods themselves. The practical consequence was a significant delay and a massive expenditure of resources to rebuild the bridges, but the psychological and symbolic cost was far greater. The story of the whipped Hellespont spread like wildfire ahead of his army, reaching the Greek defenders not as a tale of Persian power, but as one of insane arrogance. It solidified their resolve, framing their coming struggle not just as a war for territory, but as a defense of rational order against a mad tyrant who believed he could chain the ocean. This perception of overreach was brutally validated by the ultimate outcome of the campaign. Despite his initial successes at Thermopylae and the sack of Athens, Xerxes's colossal fleet was outmaneuvered and decisively defeated by the smaller, nimbler Greek triremes in the narrow straits of Salamis. His invasion force, its supply lines severed, was left stranded and vulnerable, culminating in its near-total destruction the following year at the Battle of Plataea. The man who had set out to punish the sea was ultimately humbled by it, forced to flee back across the Hellespont on a shaky boat, a stark contrast to the god-king who had once crossed on a bridge of ships. Xerxes's decision to whip the Hellespont stands as one of history's most vivid metaphors for the folly of absolute power. It teaches that when a leader confuses their authority with omnipotence, lashing out at forces beyond their control, they often reveal not their strength but the profound weakness that will inevitably lead to their downfall. Where Xerxes sought to dominate the sea and Elagabalus tried to reshape Roman religion, one emperor's controversial pursuit was not for territorial gain or theological supremacy, but for the roar of a crowd. We now enter the blood-soaked sands of the Colosseum in the late 2nd century AD to witness the stunning spectacle of Emperor Commodus, son of the revered philosopher King Marcus Aurelius, not as a spectator in the imperial box, but as a combatant in the arena. His decision to perform as a gladiator was not a fleeting eccentricity. It was a systematic and calculated devaluation of the imperial office that shocked the Roman world, drained the state's wealth, and ultimately plunged the empire into decades of chaos. To understand the sheer magnitude of this scandal, one must first appreciate the colossal social chasm in ancient Rome. Gladiators, while sometimes popular celebrities, were at the bottom of the social hierarchy. They were mostly slaves, condemned criminals, or desperate freedmen who traded their dignity for a chance at survival and fleeting fame. They were infams, legally deprived of honor and rights, their bodies property to be bloodied for public entertainment. The emperor, by contrast, was the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest, the father of the country, and the living embodiment of the state's majesty and virtue. He was supposed to be aloof, dignified, and unreachable. For him to descend into the arena was not just bizarre, it was a profound inversion of the natural order, akin to a modern head of state abandoning their duties to become a professional wrestler, but with real, lethal consequences. Commodus's motives were a toxic brew of deep-seated insecurity, narcissism, and a desperate craving for validation. He was the biological son of the great Marcus Aurelius, a man who spent his reign on the grim Danube frontier defending the empire and who embodied the Stoic ideals of duty and reason. Commodus, who had accompanied his father on campaign, inherited the throne at 19 and almost immediately turned his back on this legacy. He had no interest in the tedious administration of the empire or the hardships of frontier warfare. He wanted adoration, and he found it not in the Senate House but in the amphitheater. The arena offered him a stage where he could craft a new identity for himself, not as a wise and just ruler, but as a godlike strongman, a second Hercules whose physical prowess proved his right to rule. His appearances were not spontaneous brawls. They were meticulously staged productions designed for one purpose: to aggrandize Commodus while systematically humiliating the Roman elite. He would enter the Colosseum through the imperial gate, dressed in the lion's skin and carrying the club of Hercules. He fought in hundreds of matches, but they were all carefully rigged. His opponents were armed with blunt weapons or were animals already weakened and declawed. He would slaughter penned beasts from the safety of a raised walkway, claiming thousands of kills with spears specially designed to ensure his safety. When he did face human adversaries, they were instructed to lose, fighting not for victory but for their lives. He would grant mercy to those who groveled convincingly enough, playing the part of the magnanimous god-emperor. The Senate was forced to attend these spectacles not as honored guests but as a captive audience to their own degradation. They were made to cheer and chant prescribed slogans like "You are Lord, and you are first of all men most fortunate." "You are victorious, and you shall be victorious." Any sign of insufficient enthusiasm was noted and could be a death sentence. The cost of this vanity was astronomical. For each appearance, the emperor paid himself a massive gladiator's fee from the imperial treasury, siphoning millions of sesterces meant for the army and public works into his own hands. The cost of the exotic animals imported for his hunts alone was enough to fund a major military campaign. He drained the vast treasury his frugal father had left him, pushing the empire toward financial crisis to fund his personal theatrics. The political cost was even higher. The Praetorian Guard and the legions, the true source of power, watched with contempt as their commander-in-chief debased himself for the applause of the mob. The senatorial class, publicly humiliated, privately seethed with hatred, their plots against him multiplying. His final act of hubris was to rename Rome itself. In one of his last, most delusional decrees, he declared that the eternal city would no longer be called Rome, but Colonia Lucia Annia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus. The people, the legions, and even the calendar were to be renamed in his honor. He had fully erased the line between the state and his own ego. This was the final straw. Those closest to him, including his mistress Marcia and his Praetorian prefect Letus, realized the emperor was no longer merely an embarrassment but an existential threat to the entire system. On the last day of the year 192 AD, they orchestrated his assassination, first poisoning his food, and when that proved too slow, having his wrestling partner Narcissus strangle him in his bath. The immediate aftermath was not relief but a power vacuum. The Senate immediately declared a damnatio memoriae against him, hacking his name from monuments and overturning his decrees. But the damage was done, the precedent was set. The murder of an emperor was now a viable political tool. the respect for the office had been shattered by the man who held it. The next century would see the empire descend into the chaotic and bloody crisis of the 3rd century, where generals fought each other for the throne, the borders collapsed, and the economy nearly disintegrated. Commodus's decision to fight as a gladiator was far more than a personal folly. It was the catalyst that broke the delicate balance of power, proving that an emperor who behaved like a slave could only be dealt with like one, and in doing so, he unleashed half a century of darkness upon the Roman world. Yet, even as Commodus's vanity unraveled the empire from within, another leader's defining moment would come not from a desire for applause, but from an ultimatum that threatened to end his career and his life. We now travel back to a frigid January day in 49 BC, to the banks of a small, shallow river in northern Italy. This is the story of Julius Caesar's Rubicon, a moment so pivotal that the phrase "crossing the Rubicon" still means passing a point of no return. But this was far more than a simple border crossing. It was a single step that would shatter 5 centuries of republican tradition and plunge the Roman world into a devastating civil war. For nearly a decade, Caesar had been in Gaul, conquering vast territories and building a fiercely loyal, battle-hardened army. But back in Rome, his political enemies, led by his former ally and son-in-law, Pompey the Great, and the staunch conservative Cotto the Younger, were circling. They feared Caesar's growing power and popularity and were determined to bring him to heel. The law was clear. A provincial governor was forbidden to lead his troops outside his assigned territory. To do so was an act of treason, a declaration of war on the Senate and people of Rome itself. Caesar's command was set to expire, and his enemies demanded he return to Rome as a private citizen, stripped of his legions and his legal immunity. He knew that if he obeyed, he would be immediately arrested, put on trial, and likely forced into exile or executed. He was faced with an impossible choice: personal political destruction or the unthinkable marching on his own homeland. The Rubicon River was the official boundary between his province of Cisalpine Gaul and Italy proper. As he stood on its northern bank, he is said to have hesitated, weighing the immense consequences. The historian Suetonius records him turning to his officers and declaring, "Even yet we may draw back but once across that little bridge, and everything must be decided by arms." After a moment of tense silence, he made his choice, uttering the famous phrase, "Iacta alea isti," the die is cast, and leading the 13th Legion across the shallow waters. This was not an invasion by a foreign enemy. It was a renowned Roman general using his own soldiers to threaten the very heart of the republic he claimed to defend. The move was so shocking that it caught his opponents completely by surprise. Pompey and much of the Senate panicked, abandoning Rome to raise their own armies in Greece, effectively conceding Italy to Caesar without a fight. The immediate chaos was profound. Caesar's swift, unexpected advance threw the Italian peninsula into turmoil. Cities opened their gates to him, some out of fear, others out of genuine support from the common people who saw him as a populist champion against a corrupt and stagnant aristocracy. But this was merely the prelude to a sprawling, bloody civil war that would rage across the Mediterranean for 4 years, from the plains of Spain to the deserts of Egypt. The decisive confrontation came at the Battle of Pharsalus in Greece in 48 BC. Pompey, commanding the larger and better supplied senatorial army, was confident of victory. But Caesar's legions, veterans of a decade of brutal warfare in Gaul, were simply superior in discipline and morale. In a stunning tactical reversal, Caesar's outnumbered forces smashed Pompey's lines, sending the once mighty general fleeing for his life, only to be murdered upon landing in Egypt. Caesar's victory was total. He was declared dictator for life, and he began a sweeping series of reforms, from revising the calendar to granting citizenship to peoples outside Italy. Yet, in securing his own power, he had effectively killed the Roman Republic. The old system of shared power, checks and balances between consuls and tribunes and the Senate, was rendered meaningless. The state was now him. His actions, while saving him from his enemies, created a terrifying precedent that political disputes could now be settled not in the forum with speeches and votes, but on the battlefield with legions. He had shown that the army's loyalty to its general could outweigh its loyalty to the Republic. This precedent would haunt Rome for centuries, leading to endless cycles of civil war as future generals, Mark Antony, Octavian, and countless others, would also cross their own Rubicons. The controversy lies in weighing the necessity of his act against its profound betrayal. Was Caesar a tyrant in the making, a man so consumed by ambition that he would rather drown the world in blood than face justice? Or was he a reformer pushed into a corner by an intractable, corrupt oligarchy that refused to acknowledge his achievements and was determined to destroy him by any means? His crossing of the Rubicon was undeniably an act of treason against the legal government. It was a selfish choice that prioritized his own survival and power above the stability of the state, and it directly led to the deaths of countless Romans. Yet, one can also argue that the republic he broke was already failing, crippled by corruption, gridlock, and the vast inequality between the wealthy senatorial class and the common people. Perhaps only a seismic shock like Caesar's march could have cleared the way for the new imperial system that would bring 2 centuries of relative peace and stability under Augustus. In the end, the legacy of that fateful river crossing is this profound paradox. Caesar's act was both a necessary catalyst for change and an unforgivable crime. It ended a dysfunctional republic, but at the cost of establishing autocratic rule. It solved an immediate political crisis by creating a permanent military one. And just a few years later, on the Ides of March, Caesar would discover the ultimate price of his ambition, assassinated by senators who believed they were liberating the republic from a king, proving that while he had crossed his Rubicon, he could never truly escape the consequences of breaking the world he sought to rule. From the calculated political gambits of Caesar and Cleopatra, we now turn to a decision forged not in the cold calculus of power, but in the white-hot fires of personal violation and righteous fury. Our next story unfolds in the misty green lands of Britannia, where a queen's quest for vengeance would ignite a firestorm that nearly burned the Roman presence off the island entirely. This is the story of Queen Boudica of the Iceni and her fateful decision to lead a massive revolt against the might of Rome, a choice that remains one of history's most powerful and tragic examples of the thin line between heroic resistance and catastrophic ruin. The spark for this conflagration was an act of breathtaking Roman arrogance and brutality. When Boudica's husband, King Prasutagus, died, he willed his kingdom to be co-inherited by his 2 daughters and the Roman Emperor Nero, a common practice to ensure the safety of his family and his realm. But the Roman provincial officials saw this not as a diplomatic gesture, but as an opportunity for plunder. To them, a client kingdom without a strong male heir was simply a province waiting to be absorbed. The Roman procurator, Catus Decianus, immediately moved to annex the Iceni lands, treating the kingdom not as an ally but as a conquered territory. When Boudica, as the widow and queen, protested, the Romans stripped her of her royal title, publicly flogged her in a humiliating spectacle designed to break her spirit, and then stood by as her 2 young daughters were raped by Roman soldiers. This was more than a political annexation. It was a deliberate, savage act of terror intended to demonstrate that the Iceni were now slaves, their royal family no exception. For Boudica, this was not a political problem to be negotiated. It was a deeply personal, unforgivable wound that demanded a response in kind. Her decision to revolt was not a slow-building strategy but an immediate, visceral call to arms. She harnessed the furious energy of not just her own humiliated people, but of every tribe in southern Britain that had suffered under the Roman yoke the heavy taxes, the seizure of lands for retired legionaries, the disrespect shown to native religions. She became the avatar for a collective rage, uniting the Trinovantes and others into a massive rebel army. She was a terrifying and inspirational figure on her chariot, her tall frame and long fiery hair flowing as she rallied her warriors, declaring that the Britons were fighting for their lost freedom, their violated children, and their defiled bodies. This was a holy war. The first target was Camulogenum, modern-day Colchester. This was no ordinary town. It was a colonia, a settlement for retired Roman legionaries. To the native Britons, it was a symbol of everything they hated, a community of their former oppressors living on confiscated land, whose grand temple of Claudius stood as a blatant monument to their own subjugation. The rebels showed no mercy. They swept over the town's meager defenses, slaughtering every Roman and Roman sympathizer they could find. The temple, where the last defenders had barricaded themselves, was burned to the ground. Archaeology confirms the violence. A distinct layer of ash, known as the Boudiccan destruction layer, has been found across the city, littered with the remains of those who were killed. Word of this victory spread like wildfire, and Boudicca's army swelled with new recruits. Next, they turned to Londinium. This was not a formal Roman city yet, but a bustling, prosperous trading port, the commercial heart of the new province. The Roman governor, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, was away on campaign in Wales, crushing the Druidic stronghold on the island of Mona. He raced back upon hearing the news, but upon reaching Londinium, he made a cold, strategic calculation. His force was too small to defend the unwalled town. He made the heartbreaking decision to abandon it, evacuating as many as he could with his troops and leaving the rest to their fate. Boudicca's army poured into the undefended city, and the destruction was even more complete than at Camulogenum. The entire settlement was systematically looted and then put to the torch. The inhabitants were slaughtered indiscriminately. Tacitus reports that the British rebels had no interest in taking prisoners, only in annihilation. A third city, Verulamium, modern St. Albans, suffered a similar fate. The total death toll from the sack of these three cities is estimated by the ancient sources to be between 70 and 80,000 Romans and their allies. But Boudicca's meteoric rise contained the seeds of her own downfall. Her army, swollen with success, had become a massive, undisciplined horde, burdened with families, wagons, and plunder. They were confident, perhaps overconfident. Meanwhile, Suetonius Paulinus, one of Rome's most capable generals, had been quietly regrouping. He chose his battlefield with care, a narrow defile with a thick forest at his back protecting his flanks and rear. His force of some 10,000 professional legionaries and auxiliaries stood in tight, disciplined formations. They faced a British force that may have been 10 times larger, but was a chaotic mass of warriors, not a cohesive army. The Battle of Watling Street was a classic confrontation between Roman discipline and barbarian ferocity. The Britons, confident in their numbers, charged forward, but their attack broke against the Roman shield wall. Unable to outflank the Romans and pressed forward by the mass of their own people behind them, they were funneled into a killing zone. The Romans advanced in a wedge formation, methodically cutting them down. The battle became a massacre. The British retreat was blocked by their own ring of wagons and families, creating a horrific scene of slaughter where, Tacitus writes, even the Romans' pack animals were speared. Boudicca herself, according to tradition, escaped the field, but rather than be captured, took poison and died. The rebellion was over. The controversy surrounding Boudicca's decision is a profound and heartbreaking one. Was she a heroic freedom fighter, a symbol of resistance against imperial oppression, making a brave stand for her people's dignity? There is no denying the justice of her cause or the raw courage of her leadership. She struck a blow that terrified Rome to its core and nearly reversed the course of history in Britannia. Her story has inspired countless generations as a testament to the power of the oppressed to fight back. Yet, one must also ask, was her revolt a disastrous miscalculation that ultimately brought greater suffering to the very people she sought to avenge? In the brutal aftermath of the rebellion, the Romans enacted a fearsome retribution. While the Emperor Nero, shockingly, sent funds to help rebuild the province, the pacification campaign was ruthless. The tribes that had joined the revolt were systematically crushed, their lands confiscated, and their populations subjected to harsh reprisals. The short-term gain of sacking 3 cities was utterly eclipsed by the long-term reality of an even more oppressive and vigilant Roman occupation. The Iceni as a political entity were erased from history. Her decision to pursue total vengeance rather than a more measured political or guerrilla campaign resulted in the near-total destruction of her own culture. Her story is thus a tragic and powerful duality, a brilliant, righteous flame of defiance that, in burning so intensely, ultimately consumed everything it was meant to save. While Boudicca's rebellion represented a fiery but ultimately failed resistance to Rome's power, our next decision marks a moment where a Roman emperor didn't just tolerate a once persecuted faith, but actively embraced it, setting in motion a transformation that would redefine the empire and the entire Western world. We now arrive at a crossroads in the early 4th century, where Emperor Constantine the Great made one of the most consequential choices in history: to legalize and eventually promote Christianity, shifting it from an underground sect to the favored religion of the state. The story often begins with a vision. In 312 AD, Constantine was embroiled in a brutal civil war, preparing to face his rival Maxentius at the Milvian Bridge just outside Rome. The ancient sources, Lactantius and Eusebius, tell us that on the eve of the battle, Constantine had a profound dream or vision. He was instructed to mark the shields of his soldiers with the Chi symbol, the first 2 letters of Christ's name in Greek, with the promise, "In this sign you will conquer." Whether this was a genuine spiritual experience, a calculated political maneuver, or a combination of both remains a subject of intense debate. What is undeniable is that Constantine, who had previously worshipped the traditional Roman sun god, Sol Invictus, adopted the Christian god as his divine patron for this crucial engagement. The next day, against all odds, his forces were victorious, and Maxentius drowned in the Tiber River. His reign ended. For Constantine, the message was clear: the Christian god had delivered victory. This personal experience culminated just a year later in the famous Edict of Milan in 313 AD, a joint proclamation by Constantine and his Eastern co-emperor Licinius. On the surface, the edict was a sweeping declaration of religious toleration. It stated that Christians, and indeed all people, should be free to follow whatever religion they chose, and it ordered the restoration of all property that had been confiscated from Christian communities during the earlier persecutions. This was a monumental reversal of centuries of official policy, from Nero's scapegoating to Diocletian's great persecution just a decade prior. Christians could now worship openly without fear, their churches were returned, and their faith was no longer a capital crime. But Constantine's ambitions stretched far beyond simple toleration. He saw in Christianity a powerful tool for unification. The Roman Empire of the early 4th century was fractured, having just emerged from the chaotic crisis of the 3rd century, and was still ruled by multiple emperors. It was a patchwork of cultures, languages, and local deities. Constantine, a brilliant political strategist, recognized that the Christian Church offered something unique: a unified, hierarchical, and empire-wide organization. It had its own network of bishops, a common set of scriptures, and a message that transcended local loyalties. By aligning himself with this structured faith, he could potentially forge a new, common identity that would bind his vast and diverse domains together more effectively than the old pagan pantheon ever could. He wasn't just granting religious freedom, he was co-opting a powerful institution to serve the needs of the state. His promotion of Christianity was both symbolic and profoundly material. He poured imperial funds into the construction of magnificent basilicas, most notably Old St. Peter's in Rome and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, physically planting the faith at the center of public life. He granted the clergy special privileges, exempting them from taxes and public duties, effectively creating a privileged class tied directly to the imperial favor. Perhaps most significantly, he involved himself directly in church affairs, acting as a mediator to resolve internal disputes. In 325 AD, he convened and personally presided over the Council of Nicaea, the first ecumenical council, to settle the bitter theological debate over Arianism and produce a unified statement of belief, the Nicene Creed. This set a profound and controversial precedent. The Roman state was now in the business of defining Christian orthodoxy. This blurring of lines between church and state is at the heart of the controversy surrounding Constantine's decision. Was he a sincerely devout convert or a pragmatic politician using a growing religion as a tool for social control? The evidence is deeply mixed. He continued to use ambiguous symbolism, minting coins with the sun god Sol Invictus well after his conversion, leading some historians to suggest he syncretized the two, viewing the Christian god as the most powerful of many divine forces. His personal life was far from saintly. He had his eldest son, Crispus, and his own wife, Fausta, executed in a scandal that remains shrouded in mystery. Most tellingly, he delayed his baptism, the ceremony that would wash away all sin, until his deathbed. This was not uncommon at the time, as many believed baptism could only be received once, but it also suggests a leader who wanted to keep his political options open and ensure a clean slate at the very end. The long-term consequences of his decision are almost impossible to overstate. In the short term, it worked. Christianity provided a new glue for the empire, and Constantine's reign ushered in a period of stability and renewal. But in the long run, it fundamentally altered both the church and the state. The church, once a persecuted body of martyrs, became a powerful, sometimes oppressive, institution intertwined with political power, a shift that would lead to its own internal corruptions and the violent suppression of paganism and heresy in the centuries to follow. For the state, it meant that the emperor's legitimacy was now tied to his orthodoxy, making religious dissent synonymous with political treason. The Roman Empire became the Christian Roman Empire, and when the western half collapsed, it was this Christian identity that was inherited by the medieval kingdoms that rose from its ashes, shaping the course of European history for the next 1,000 years. Constantine's decision was a grand bargain, a fusion of faith and power that saved the church from persecution but at the cost of its innocence, creating a legacy of both immense cultural achievement and deep, enduring conflict. From the grand political and religious transformations of emperors, we now venture into the realm of myth, where a king's wish serves as one of history's most enduring cautionary tales. The story of King Midas and his golden touch is often told as a simple fable for children, a warning against greed. But when we pull back the layers of this myth, we find a far more complex and fascinating decision, one that may well be rooted in the very real economic anxieties of an ancient kingdom. According to the most famous version from Ovid's Metamorphoses, the myth begins not with greed but with an act of unexpected hospitality. The old and satyr Silenus, a devoted companion of the god Dionysus, becomes separated from his master's wild procession. He is found wandering, drunk and disoriented by the subjects of King Midas. Instead of turning him away, Midas recognizes the satyr and welcomes him into his palace, hosting him with lavish feasts and entertainment for 10 full days and nights. This was no small act, it was a profound gesture of respect toward the divine. When Dionysus, frantic with worry, is finally reunited with his beloved friend, he is so overjoyed by Midas's kindness that he offers the king any reward he desires. This is the pivotal moment of choice. Midas, faced with the limitless generosity of a god, makes his fateful request: "Grant that whatever I touch with my body shall be turned to yellow gold." At first glance, this seems like the height of foolish short-sightedness. Why not ask for wisdom or long life or the continued prosperity of his kingdom? But we must consider the perspective of a Bronze Age monarch. Gold was not just wealth, it was stability, power, and divine favor. It cemented alliances through gifts, paid for armies to defend borders, and created magnificent offerings to the gods. In a world of constant uncertainty, famine, invasion, disease, the ability to generate limitless, perfect wealth would have seemed like the ultimate security, a way to freeze the world in a state of permanent, prosperous perfection. Midas's decision likely felt less like greed and more like genius, a solution to every earthly problem a king could face. The immediate consequence, of course, was a nightmare of his own making. His joy as he touched a twig and then a stone, transforming them into gold, quickly turned to horror as he reached for food and water, only to find his bread a hard, metallic lump and his wine a stream of molten gold he could not drink. The embrace meant to comfort his daughter turned her into a cold, golden statue. The myth vividly illustrates the paradox of his desire. He had been granted the ultimate form of wealth, but in achieving it, he lost access to every fundamental thing that makes life worth living: sustenance, companionship, and love. He was the richest man in the world, and yet he was starving and utterly alone, imprisoned by his own power. This is where the legend likely brushes against historical reality. The Phrygian kingdom in central Anatolia, which Midas ruled around the late 8th century BC, was indeed famously wealthy. The real King Midas was said to have donated a magnificent golden throne to the oracle at Delphi. But this wealth may have had a darker source. Historians and archaeologists suggest the Phrygians possessed advanced techniques for mining gold, and crucially, for refining it using a salt cementation process that could create a valuable gold and silver alloy called electrum. This process required massive quantities of water, leading to severe environmental degradation, deforestation, and the polluting of local water sources with salt and mining debris. The mythological golden touch that destroyed the king's food and water supply could be a powerful folk memory of this very real ecological cost. The kingdom's wealth literally poisoned its own land, leaving its people starving amidst apparent plenty, a stark metaphor for the hidden consequences of an economy overly reliant on a single extractive industry. The myth's resolution offers a path to redemption. A horrified and starving Midas begs Dionysus to take back his cursed gift. The god, taking pity on him, instructs him to wash away his power in the source of the river Pactolus. As Midas bathes in its waters, the golden touch flows from him and into the river's sands, which, the legend says, are why the Pactolus became famous in antiquity for its gold-rich deposits. This act of cleansing in the natural world completes the story's symbolism. True wealth, it argues, is not found in hoarding a static, sterile metal, but in the flowing, life-giving resources of the earth and the cycle of give and take. Midas, humbled and cured, is said to have renounced materialism altogether, retreating into the woods to become a worshipper of Pan, the god of the wild, untamed natural world he had once tried to conquer and monetize. King Midas's decision, whether seen as a foolish wish or a desperate economic strategy, transcends its origins to become a universal story. It warns us that the single-minded pursuit of one form of value can blind us to all others, turning the very things that sustain us into cold, inaccessible monuments. It is a lesson for the ages, reminding us that the most dangerous prison is not one of poverty, but one of gilded, self-imposed isolation. Leaving behind the cautionary myths of cursed wishes, we now journey to the very real, windswept moors of northern Britain, where the legacy of an emperor's ambition was literally set in stone. Across 73 miles of the most challenging terrain on the island, from the River Tyne to the Solway Firth, stands one of the Roman Empire's most astonishing and enduring monuments, Hadrian's Wall. But this was far more than a simple barrier. It was the physical manifestation of a profound and controversial shift in imperial policy, a decision by the Emperor Hadrian to define the limits of Roman power not through endless expansion, but through a statement of absolute, impenetrable separation. When Hadrian ascended to the throne in 117 AD, he inherited an empire at its greatest geographical extent, but one that was dangerously overstretched. His predecessor, Trajan, had conquered vast new territories in Dacia and Mesopotamia, but holding them was proving costly and difficult. Revolts had erupted in recently conquered regions, including a massive uprising in Britain itself. Hadrian, a pragmatic and thoughtful emperor, recognized that the empire's resources were finite. His new philosophy was one of consolidation, defense, and defined borders, a stark departure from the centuries-old Roman ideal of limitless expansion. His famous wall in Britain was the ultimate expression of this new strategy. It was a declaration that here, on this remote frontier, Rome would go no further. The sheer scale of the project is almost incomprehensible. This was not a simple fence, it was a sophisticated military complex. At its core was a stone wall, initially 15 feet high and 10 feet wide, punctuated by a small fort every Roman mile and 2 observation towers in between each fort, a system allowing for rapid communication and a constant watch over the northern waste. On the northern side, a deep, V-shaped ditch added an extra layer of defense. To the south, a massive earthwork known as the vallum, consisting of a large ditch flanked by 2 parallel mounds, created a military zone, controlling civilian movement and protecting the rear of the wall's garrisons. Building this required an army of labor, not of slaves, but of the Roman legions themselves. The 3 legions stationed in Britain, along with their auxiliaries, were put to work as stonemasons, surveyors, and engineers, quarrying local stone and transforming the landscape with a speed and precision that still inspires awe. The cost to the imperial treasury was astronomical, consuming funds that could have been used for new campaigns, public works, or bribes to keep barbarian tribes at bay. This is the heart of the historical debate. Was Hadrian's wall a stroke of defensive genius or a colossal waste of resources that signaled a Roman retreat into fearful isolation? Proponents of the wall point to its undeniable effectiveness as a controlled border. It was not meant to be an impermeable barrier against a massive invasion. No wall truly could be. Instead, it functioned as a formidable checkpoint, a customs house, and a psychological deterrent all in one. It regulated the movement of people and goods, allowing trade to be taxed and monitored through designated gates. It prevented small-scale raids from the northern tribes, the Picts, who could no longer swiftly descend upon the wealthy Roman farms to the south, steal livestock, and disappear back into the mist. For the soldiers stationed there, it provided a clear, defensible position. A small force could hold the wall against a much larger one, freeing up the rest of the army to be deployed elsewhere. In this view, the wall was a force multiplier, a symbol of Roman engineering prowess that projected power and stability, effectively buying peace for the prosperous province of Britannia. The critics, however, see a different symbol entirely. They argue the wall represented a moment of peak overextension, where the empire finally admitted it could grow no larger. It was a monument not to strength, but to limitation and even fear. The immense permanent commitment of 3 legions to guard a single static line tied down a significant portion of the empire's military, might in one remote corner, making those troops unavailable for crises on other frontiers like the Danube or in the east. Furthermore, the wall created a permanent us vs. them dynamic. The peoples to the north, who might have been gradually assimilated or managed through diplomacy and client kingdoms, were now officially and physically branded as outsiders, barbarians forever separated from the Roman world. This hard border may have actually fostered a stronger, unified identity among the disparate northern tribes, who now had a common enemy in the form of the immense structure that declared them unworthy of inclusion. The resources poured into its construction and maintenance, stone, manpower, money, could arguably have been better spent on more flexible military strategies, such as a network of forts and mobile cavalry units that could have policed a wider area. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. The wall did bring a measure of stability to the region for much of the following 2 centuries, though it was breached several times, most notably during the Great Pictish invasions that contributed to the end of Roman rule in Britain. It was abandoned for a time in favor of the more northerly Antonine Wall, only to be recommissioned, proving its strategic value was recognized more than once. Hadrian's decision was a calculated risk based on a cold assessment of imperial reality. He chose to invest heavily in a single, definitive solution to secure one vulnerable flank, accepting the massive upfront cost for what he hoped would be long-term security. It was the decision of an administrator, not a conqueror. In the end, Hadrian's Wall stands as a powerful paradox, a breathtaking achievement of engineering that simultaneously represents both the magnificent power of Rome and the first, unmistakable admission that even that power had its limits. It was the beginning of the end of the dream of an infinite empire, a permanent line drawn in the stone of a foreign land, marking the point where Roman ambition finally, definitively stopped. Yet as Hadrian's Wall marked a limit to imperial ambition in the West, a different kind of boundary was being dissolved far to the south in the ancient land of the Nile. Following centuries of fragmentation and foreign rule, a new pharaoh arose with a singular goal: to reunify Egypt and expel the occupying Assyrians. This was Psamtik I, founder of the 26th dynasty, and his controversial solution to this monumental task would forever alter the fabric of Egyptian civilization, setting in motion a chain of events that would ultimately lead to its subjugation. His decision was to open the kingdom's treasury and its borders, hiring an army of foreign Greek mercenaries to win back his own country. To understand the sheer audacity of this choice, one must appreciate the deep-seated Egyptian worldview. For millennia, the pharaoh was the living god Horus, the defender of Mat, the sacred order of the universe against the chaos of foreign lands, personified as the 9 bows, the traditional enemies of Egypt. The military was a native institution, and warriors were celebrated in tomb paintings and inscriptions for their service to the god-king. By turning to hired soldiers from across the sea, Psamtik was not merely utilizing a new resource, he was overturning a fundamental pillar of pharaonic ideology. He was essentially inviting chaos itself to restore order. The Greeks he hired were not random adventurers. They were predominantly heavy infantry known as hoplites from the city-states of Ionia and Caria in Asia Minor. These men were products of the Greek Archaic period, warriors who fought in a tightly packed formation called the phalanx, protected by massive bronze shields and long thrusting spears. This was a style of warfare far more disciplined and shock-oriented than the more fluid, archer-based tactics traditionally favored by Egyptian armies. Psamtik recognized their superior military technology and tactics as the key to overcoming his rivals, the other petty dynasts who controlled parts of a divided Egypt under Assyrian oversight. With the backing of these Greek professionals, Psamtik methodically crushed his local opponents, finally driving out the weary Assyrians and proclaiming himself the sole ruler of a reunited Egypt around 656 BC. The immediate success was undeniable. Egypt was whole again, ushering in the Sate period, a final renaissance of native Egyptian culture, art, and architecture that consciously looked back to the Old and Middle Kingdoms for inspiration. To secure his power, Psamtik rewarded his mercenaries not just with pay, but with land. He granted them permanent settlements in the Nile Delta, most notably a fortified camp at Croesus, which would later grow into the only official Greek trading colony in Egypt. This was the beginning of the end for Egypt's isolation. Croesus became a bustling hub of cross-cultural exchange, where Greek pottery, wine, and olive oil flowed in, and Egyptian grain, papyrus, and luxury goods flowed out. Greek merchants, artists, and thinkers followed the soldiers, settling in the Delta and beginning a centuries-long dialogue between the two cultures. But this fruitful exchange came with a devastating long-term cost. Psamtik's policy created a dangerous dependency. The subsequent pharaohs of his dynasty continued to rely on Greek hoplites as the core of their military power, alongside other mercenaries from Lydia and Phoenicia. This had a corrosive effect on the native Egyptian military caste. Why invest in training and equipping a costly native army when you could simply hire proven professionals on demand? Over time, the martial tradition within Egypt atrophied. The proud warrior class that had once defended the borders found itself sidelined, its role supplanted by foreigners who owed their loyalty not to the pharaoh as a god, but to the pharaoh as an employer. This created a deep well of resentment among the native population and the powerful priestly class, who saw these foreigners with their strange customs and languages as a pollution of the sacred land of Kemet. This reliance on mercenaries also created a massive and constant drain on the state's economy. The treasury had to be filled with silver and gold to meet the payroll of thousands of foreign troops, a pressure that likely led to heavier taxation of the Egyptian populace. More dangerously, it made Egyptian foreign policy hostage to the availability and loyalty of its hired soldiers. The true weakness of this system was exposed a century later when the rising Persian Empire under Cambyses II set its sights on Egypt. At the decisive Battle of Pelusium in 525 BC, the Persian army faced the forces of Pharaoh Psamtik III. The Greek historian Herodotus reports that the Persians, knowing the Egyptians revered cats as manifestations of the goddess Bastet, painted images of cats on their shields and even drove cats before their line. The Greek mercenaries, with no cultural taboo against harming the animals, would have fought on, but the native Egyptian soldiers were allegedly paralyzed with religious fear, unable to loose their arrows lest they harm a sacred creature. Whether this tale is apocryphal or not, the battle was a crushing defeat. The Greeks, fighting for pay, could not replicate the desperate, patriotic fervor of a native army defending its homeland. Egypt fell to Persia with startling speed, becoming a satrapy of a foreign empire for the next century. Psamtik I's decision was therefore a classic historical paradox. In the short term, it was a brilliant, pragmatic masterstroke that achieved its immediate goal of liberation and reunification, even sparking a cultural revival. But it did so by mortgaging the nation's future military sovereignty. By outsourcing his military power, he inadvertently dismantled the native institution that was essential for long-term survival. He solved the crisis of the present by creating a far greater vulnerability for the future, proving that a nation that no longer believes it can defend itself with its own people has already lost a crucial part of its soul, making its wealth and culture a tempting target for the next ambitious conqueror. After the dramatic and often chaotic reigns we've explored, the story of Emperor Tiberius presents a different kind of controversy, one not of explosive action but of profound and puzzling inaction. In the year 26 AD, the Roman world watched in stunned disbelief as its emperor, then in his late 60s, did the unthinkable. He simply walked away. Tiberius, the adopted son of Augustus and the second emperor of Rome, boarded a ship and sailed away from the capital, leaving the gears of power turning behind him. He retreated to the stunning, secluded island of Capri, a jewel of limestone cliffs and azure waters in the Bay of Naples, and with a few brief exceptions, he would never set foot in Rome again for the remaining 11 years of his life. This was not a vacation, it was an abdication of presence, and it would create a vacuum of power into which darkness eagerly flowed. To understand the shock of this decision, we must first understand the man and his path to power. Tiberius was never meant to be emperor. He was a grim, serious, and highly competent military commander, forced into the line of succession only after the premature deaths of Augustus's preferred heirs. He was a republican at heart, thrust into the role of monarch, and he never seemed comfortable with the theatrical aspects of the job, the endless glad-handing in the forum, the flattery of the Senate, the very public life of a princeps. His reign began with promise. He was diligent, fiscally responsible, and initially deferred to the Senate. But a series of personal tragedies, including the death of his only son Drusus, whom he deeply loved, seemed to hollow him out. He grew increasingly dour, suspicious, and withdrawn from the suffocating politics of the city. Capri offered an escape, a fortified paradise far from the whispers and conspiracies of the capital, and he took it. The immediate and most catastrophic consequence of his absence was the rise of Lucius Aelius Sejanus, the prefect of the Praetorian Guard. Before Tiberius left, Sejanus was the commander of the emperor's personal bodyguard, a position of significant trust. With the emperor gone, Sejanus became the sole conduit of power. All communication between the Senate and the absent Tiberius flowed through him. He controlled access to the emperor, and crucially, he controlled the only concentrated military force in Italy, which he shrewdly consolidated from scattered barracks into a single, massive camp just outside Rome's walls. This gave him the power to intimidate the Senate and the people alike. Tiberius, from his island villa, seemed to place his full trust in this man, granting him unprecedented power and honors. Sejanus, now the effective ruler of Rome, began a systematic and terrifying purge of his real and imagined enemies. He skillfully manipulated Tiberius's inherent paranoia, feeding him rumors of plots and conspiracies back in the city. The ancient sources, particularly Tacitus and Suetonius, describe a reign of terror unfolding in Rome while Tiberius remained sequestered on Capri. A series of treason trials, the infamous Maestas trials, were launched. These were not trials based on acts of treason, but on vague charges of diminished majesty, disrespecting the emperor. A careless joke, a poorly chosen phrase, or even a dream about the emperor reported by an enemy could lead to a conviction. Properties were confiscated, families were ruined, and opponents of Sejanus were executed or driven to suicide. The Senate, cowed by the presence of the Praetorian Guard just beyond their doors, complied with this judicial murder. Sejanus was eliminating anyone who could challenge his authority, all under the pretense of protecting an absent emperor. And what of Tiberius during this time? The rumors that swirled around his life on Capri are some of the most salacious and enduring in history, though we must treat them with a degree of skepticism as they come from his political enemies. Suetonius paints a picture of utter depravity, describing the Villa Jovis on Capri as a palace of unspeakable sexual deviancy and cruelty, where the aging emperor indulged in every possible vice with a team of young attendants and experts in corruption known as spintri. He is alleged to have had young children trained to swim around him and nibble at his body when he bathed, and to have executed those who dared to witness his activities. While these tales are likely exaggerated propaganda, they reflect the profound mystery and disgust that settled over his self-imposed exile. The emperor was not just absent, he was, in the public imagination, rotting away in a private world of madness and perversion while his right-hand man unleashed hell in his name. The turning point came when Tiberius's sister-in-law, Antonia, managed to smuggle a letter to Capri, revealing the full extent of Sejanus's ambition and his plot to marry into the imperial family and seize the throne for himself. This finally shattered Tiberius's trust. What followed was a masterclass in cold, ruthless political maneuvering. Tiberius did not rush back to Rome. Instead, he plotted from afar, communicating in his usual cryptic and indirect manner. He appointed a new co-consul, sent a letter to the Senate that praised Sejanus but also contained subtle, veiled commands, and lured his prefect into a false sense of security. On the 18th of October in 31 AD, Sejanus entered the Senate House expecting to be granted the tribunician power, the final step toward becoming co-emperor. Instead, the letter from Tiberius was read aloud. It began with pleasantries, then slowly turned, listing accusations and finally condemning Sejanus to death. The Praetorian Guard, previously loyal to Sejanus, had been quietly switched to a new commander. They arrested him on the spot, and the Senate, sensing the wind had changed, eagerly condemned him. He was strangled in prison, and his body was torn apart by a mob in the streets. The purge that followed was even more bloody than the first, as Tiberius's vengeance fell upon Sejanus's family, friends, and supporters. So, was Tiberius's retreat a strategic retirement or a disastrous abandonment of duty? The case for strategy is that he may have intended to avoid the daily friction of Roman politics, believing he could rule more effectively through deputies from a distance, much like a modern CEO. By leaving, he arguably avoided the potential for assassination in the city and may have believed Sejanus was a capable administrator. His eventual takedown of Sejanus proves he was never entirely out of touch and was capable of decisive, brutal action when necessary. However, the case for abandonment is overwhelmingly strong. His absence created the conditions for Sejanus's terror. A present emperor would have been able to sense the political climate firsthand, to judge character for himself, and to prevent such a concentration of malignant power. By withdrawing, Tiberius abdicated his most basic duty to govern. He allowed the machinery of the state to be hijacked for a private agenda of murder, fostering an atmosphere of fear and suspicion that would poison Roman political life for generations. His reign demonstrates that the greatest danger to an empire is not always a bad emperor, but sometimes an absent one. A ruler so disillusioned and detached that he allows the very institution he commands to be turned against its own people, all from the peaceful, sun-drenched cliffs of a distant island paradise. From the isolated cliffs of Capri and the paranoid reign of Tiberius, we now journey back nearly a millennium to the sun-baked hills of Judea, to a kingdom at its peak of glory and a king renowned for his wisdom, whose very policies designed to ensure his legacy would instead plant the seeds for its total collapse. This is the story of King Solomon and his fateful decision to fund a grand, divinely sanctioned vision with a system of heavy taxation and forced labor that would fracture his nation forever. The biblical narrative presents Solomon's reign as a golden age of unprecedented peace and prosperity. His father, David, had been a man of war, consolidating the 12 tribes of Israel through blood and conquest. Solomon inherited a unified kingdom, and his famous God-given wisdom was to be the instrument of its flourishing. The centerpiece of his ambitious building program was, of course, the first temple in Jerusalem, a permanent, magnificent house for the Ark of the Covenant, intended to replace the mobile tabernacle and centralize worship for all Israelites. This was not just a construction project, it was a theological and political statement of a mature, powerful nation under its wise king. But the temple was only one part of a vast campaign of monumental architecture. He also constructed an immense new royal palace complex that took nearly twice as long to build as the temple itself, fortified key cities like Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer as strategic military and administrative centers, and built store cities for his vast goods and chariot cities for his enormous 12,000-horse cavalry. The scale of these projects was staggering, and their cost had to be paid for by someone. Solomon's solution was to reorganize the entire kingdom into a more efficient but brutally extractive economic engine. He famously divided the land into 12 new administrative districts, each under a royal officer. Crucially, these new districts did not follow the old tribal boundaries. This was a deliberate move to break down tribal loyalties and replace them with a direct economic obligation to the central monarchy. Each district was responsible for providing 1 month's worth of provisions for the royal court. The description in 1 Kings is telling. Each district had to supply such an immense quantity of fine flour, meal, livestock, and poultry that it is almost comical, painting a picture of a court of unimaginable consumption. This system of taxation in kind was back-breaking, but it was the demand for labor that truly ignited resentment. The Bible makes a careful and politically charged distinction between two types of laborers. There were the mass-oved, the forced labor gangs drawn from the surviving Canaanite populations within Israel's borders. These were people who had no political rights. They were a conquered underclass, and their conscription was seen as a standard practice of the era. However, the text is very clear that for the most prestigious projects, particularly the construction of the temple itself, Solomon did not use Israelite slaves but employed skilled craftsmen and paid laborers. The controversy erupts over the other labor force, the corvée. This was a system of state-imposed forced labor, a tax paid not in goods or money but in time and physical toil. 30,000 Israelites were conscripted to work in shifts, spending 1 month laboring in the Lebanese forests for King Hiram of Tyre, Solomon's primary ally and supplier of cedar and cypress wood, and 2 months at home. Another 70,000 were forced to bear burdens, and 80,000 more to quarry stone in the hills. For a generation that remembered the stories of their ancestors being slaves in Egypt, this state-sanctioned conscription to build the king's projects felt like a bitter betrayal. They had been delivered from Pharaoh's brick pits only to be sent to their own king's quarries and forests. The archaeological record, while unable to confirm Solomon's specific projects with absolute certainty, provides powerful circumstantial evidence for this era of intense, centralized economic activity. The sites of Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer all show remarkably similar city planning from this period, featuring identical 6-chambered gates and large public structures built with distinctive ashlar masonry, stones cut and shaped into perfect rectangles. This standardization is the hallmark of a powerful, centralized authority with the resources to deploy engineers and architects across the kingdom to execute a single, cohesive vision. Furthermore, evidence of large-scale food processing, like olive presses and grain storage facilities, points to a system designed to collect and redistribute agricultural surplus on a massive scale, exactly matching the biblical description of the tax districts. The immediate consequence was a deep and festering resentment, particularly in the northern tribes. The burden was not felt equally. The southern tribe of Judah, Solomon's own tribe, appears to have been given preferential treatment, perhaps exempted from the worst of the corvée. The northern tribes, farther from the capital and with their ancient tribal identities deliberately undermined by the new administrative districts, bore the brunt of the economic hardship. They saw their young men sent away to dangerous work, their harvests siphoned off to feed a lavish court in Jerusalem, and their wealth funneled into projects that, while grand, seemed to benefit the dynasty of David more than the people of Israel. The glory of the temple, a symbol of unity, was built on a foundation of perceived injustice. This simmering discontent exploded immediately after Solomon's death. His son and heir, Rehoboam, traveled to the northern city of Shechem to be confirmed as king. The northern tribes, led by a former forced labor overseer named Jeroboam, who had earlier fled to Egypt to escape Solomon's wrath, presented Rehoboam with an ultimatum: "Your father made our yoke heavy. Now therefore lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke that he placed on us, and we will serve you." The old advisors who had served Solomon counseled Rehoboam to speak kindly to the people and agree to their terms, to become a servant to the people and earn their loyalty. But Rehoboam, arrogant and surrounded by young contemporaries, instead gave a famously brutal reply: "My father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions." It was the final, catastrophic spark. The northern 10 tribes immediately rebelled, seceding to form their own kingdom of Israel, leaving Rehoboam with only Judah and Benjamin in the southern kingdom of Judah. The unified kingdom of David and Solomon lasted only a single generation. Solomon's decision, for all its grandeur and its divine purpose in building the temple, had fundamentally broken the covenant between the ruler and the ruled. He had traded the fragile loyalty of the tribes for the permanence of stone, and in doing so, he ensured that the very kingdom he sought to glorify would not survive him. His story is a timeless lesson in the peril of overreach, demonstrating that even the wisest of leaders can fall prey to the intoxicating allure of legacy. and that the most magnificent monuments can sometimes be built upon the deepest fractures. If Solomon's policies fractured a kingdom through economic overreach, one Roman emperor's decree would seek to unify an entire empire by severing its spiritual roots. From the divided kingdoms of ancient Israel, we now fast forward to the late 4th century, to a Roman Empire struggling under the weight of its own vastness and internal strife. Here, Emperor Theodosius I, a ruler determined to impose absolute unity, made a decision that would fundamentally and violently reshape the religious landscape of the Western world. His series of decrees, culminating in 391 AD, that effectively outlawed pagan worship across the Roman Empire and made Nicene Christianity the state religion. The context was one of immense imperial stress. Theodosius had recently defeated two powerful usurpers and had seen the stunning defeat of a Roman army by Gothic forces at the Battle of Adrianople. The empire felt fragile, fractious, and vulnerable. In this climate, Theodosius, a devout and fervent Christian from Hispania, saw religious uniformity not as a matter of personal preference, but as a critical tool of state policy. He believed a single, unified faith would bind his diverse and quarrelsome subjects together, creating the social cohesion he thought necessary for the empire's survival. His earlier Edict of Thessalonica in 380 had already declared Nicene Christianity the official religion of the state, but the new laws of 391 went drastically further. They banned all public and private pagan sacrifice, forbade entry into pagan temples, and mandated that the ancient state funds that had supported the Vestal Virgins and other pagan priesthoods be cut off and redirected to the imperial treasury. For the first time, traditional Roman religion was not just sidelined, it was criminalized. The enforcement of these laws was not a gentle process of cultural transition. It was often brutal and shockingly violent. Theodosius empowered Christian bishops and monks, many of whom had endured periods of persecution themselves, to act as enforcers. These men, filled with righteous zeal and a long-simmering anger, led mobs of followers in coordinated attacks on the physical heart of paganism, its temples. The most famous and symbolic of these assaults was the total destruction of the Serapeum in Alexandria, one of the largest and most magnificent temples in the entire ancient world. This vast complex was not merely a temple to the Greco-Egyptian god Serapis. It was also a university library, a center of Neoplatonic philosophy, and a repository of ancient knowledge that rivaled the legendary Library of Alexandria itself. The Christian patriarch Theophilus, with the implicit backing of the emperor, led a mob that stormed the complex. The ancient cult statue of Serapis was hacked apart, dragged through the streets, and burned. The library's priceless pagan texts were looted or destroyed. The site was then consecrated as a Christian church. This act sent a chillingly clear message. The old gods were not just dead, their very memory was to be erased from the earth. This official sanctioning of destruction unleashed a wave of similar attacks across the empire. In Syria, the great temple of Jupiter in Apamea was torn down. In Gaul, the sacred druidic groves were burned. In North Africa, Christian writers celebrated the smashing of idols and the purification of pagan spaces. This was not a spontaneous popular movement. It was a top-down cultural revolution, a state-sponsored program of religious cleansing. Resistance was met with swift and severe punishment. Those caught performing traditional rites could be executed. The ancient, public, and communal nature of Roman religion made its practitioners easy targets. The world was being forcibly remade, and the violence required to do it was justified as a holy war against demonic forces and a necessary step toward eternal salvation. The long-term consequences of Theodosius's decision are almost impossible to overstate. In the immediate term, it sparked fierce conflicts, most notably with the powerful pagan senator Virius Nicomachus Flavianus, who supported the usurper Eugenius in a last, desperate stand to preserve the old ways. Their defeat at the Battle of the Frigidus in 394 was seen by Christian writers as a definitive sign of God's judgment. O ka o enche a te ya elyeri no, cementing Theodosius's religious victory. But the true legacy was the systematic eradication of traditions that had defined Mediterranean life for well over a millennium. The ancient chain of ritual, knowledge, and practice that stretched back to the founding of Rome was broken within a generation. The Olympic Games, fundamentally a religious festival dedicated to Zeus, were abolished. The voice of the Sibyl was silenced. The eternal flame of Vesta, which had burned for over 1,000 years as a symbol of Rome's permanence, was extinguished. Theodosius had indeed achieved his goal of religious unity, but at a catastrophic cultural cost. Countless works of art, literature, and philosophy were lost forever in the frenzy of destruction. The complex, pluralistic spiritual world of antiquity was replaced with a mandatory orthodoxy, setting a dangerous precedent for the violent suppression of heresy and dissent that would haunt Europe for centuries. His decision created a unified Christendom, but it was a unity born from intolerance, one that closed the book on the ancient world and inaugurated the militant, doctrinaire era of the medieval church. He had cemented Christianity's dominance, but in doing so, he demonstrated a terrifying truth: that when a faith born in persecution gains absolute power, it can all too easily become the persecutor itself, using the tools of the state to mandate belief and erase the past in the name of a singular truth. While Theodosius sought to enforce religious unity through imperial decree, our next story unfolds in a radically different key, not one of enforced conformity, but of calculated liberation. We journey now to the heart of the 6th century BC, to the court of the man who had built the largest empire the world had yet seen, Cyrus the Great of Persia. After his stunning conquest of Babylon, Cyrus faced the monumental task of governing a wildly diverse collection of peoples, cultures, and religions. His solution was a revolutionary policy of tolerance and restoration, the most famous example of which was his astonishing decree allowing the exiled Jewish population to return to their homeland and rebuild their temple in Jerusalem. To appreciate the sheer audacity of this decision, we must first understand the brutal norms of ancient conquest. When a powerful empire like Assyria or Babylon defeated a rebellious people, standard practice was deportation and deletion. The vanquished population would be forcibly relocated to a distant part of the empire to break their national spirit. Their cities would be razed and their temples, the physical and spiritual centers of their identity, would be systematically desecrated and destroyed. This was the fate the Jews had suffered decades earlier when the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar sacked Jerusalem, tore down the walls, and burned the magnificent Temple of Solomon to the ground. The elite of Judah were marched into exile in Babylon, where they lived as captives, their songs of Zion silenced by grief. Cyrus's approach was a complete inversion of this model. Instead of crushing conquered identities, he sought to co-opt and empower them. His motive was not merely benevolence, it was brilliant, pragmatic statecraft. He understood that an empire held together by fear and repression was inherently unstable, a powder keg of resentment waiting to explode. His new model of governance was to present himself not as a foreign oppressor, but as a legitimate ruler chosen by the local gods to restore order and prosperity. By allowing deported peoples to return home and rebuild their sacred sites, he transformed them from potential rebels into grateful, loyal subjects. He earned their allegiance by honoring their traditions. This policy is immortalized in two extraordinary documents, the biblical book of Ezra and the Cyrus cylinder. The cylinder, a small, barrel-shaped clay object inscribed in Akkadian cuneiform, was discovered in 1879 and is often called the world's first charter of human rights. In it, Cyrus boasts of his conquest of Babylon and details his new approach to empire. He writes, "I return to these sacred cities on the other side of the Tigris, the sanctuaries of which have been in ruins for a long time. the images which used to live therein and established for them permanent sanctuaries. I also gathered all their former inhabitants and returned to them their habitations. This was official policy. The Bible echoes this proclamation almost verbatim in the book of Ezra, chapter 1, where it records Cyrus's decree. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem in Judah. Any of his people among you may go up to Jerusalem and build the temple of the Lord. The impact on the Jewish community was nothing short of seismic. After decades of despair, a door of hope swung open. Not all Jews chose to make the arduous journey back to a ruined homeland. Many had established successful lives in Babylon, but a significant group fired with religious zeal did. Led by the prince Zerubbabel and the high priest Jeshua, they returned to Judah with the royal permission and, crucially, with the temple treasures that Nebuchadnezzar had looted, which Cyrus now returned to them. Their first task was to rebuild the altar and lay the foundations for the second temple. The biblical narrative describes a scene of powerful emotions. The old priests who remembered the glory of the first temple wept aloud at the modest new foundations, while the younger generation shouted for joy. This act of rebuilding was far more than a construction project. It was the rebirth of a nation, the preservation of a faith, and the beginning of the Second Temple period in Jewish history, a defining era that would shape Judaism into the form we would recognize today. The long-term consequences of Cyrus's decision are immeasurable. For the Jewish people, it ensured their survival as a distinct cultural and religious entity. Without a homeland and a central place of worship, their identity, like that of the 10 lost tribes of Israel, might have simply dissipated into the cultures around them. Instead, the restoration under Cyrus allowed them to re-root themselves, codify their scriptures, and solidify the practices that would sustain them through future exiles. This act cemented Cyrus's unique place in the Hebrew Bible, where he is the only non-Jew to be given the title Meshiach, or Anointed One, a testament to the profound gratitude and reverence he earned. For the wider world, Cyrus's policy established a powerful precedent for religious tolerance and the rights of minority peoples within a larger state, a radical idea that would echo through the ages. His strategy of ruling through cultural respect rather than brute force became the gold standard for managing a multi-ethnic empire, a model that future superpowers would look back to for inspiration. In the end, Cyrus's decree was a masterpiece of enlightened self-interest. He secured the western flank of his empire by creating a buffer state in Judah that was eternally grateful to Persia. He spent very little of his own resources, simply granting permission and returning stolen goods, yet he reaped an immense harvest of loyalty and stability. It stands as a timeless lesson that the most enduring power is not always seized by the sword, but is sometimes won through an open hand. Following the revolutionary tolerance of Cyrus, we now witness a stunning reversal of fortune, a moment where imperial arrogance met its most humiliating end. Our journey brings us to the tumultuous 3rd century, a period often called the crisis of the 3rd century, where the Roman Empire nearly tore itself apart through civil war, economic collapse, and rampant foreign invasion. It is against this backdrop of sheer chaos that Emperor Valerian made a decision of breathtaking risk: to personally lead a grand campaign against the rising Sasanian Persian Empire and its brilliant, ruthless King of Kings, Shapur I. This was not merely a military expedition, it was a desperate gamble to restore Roman glory. Instead, it would result in the single greatest humiliation in the entire history of the Roman imperial office. Valerian, an elderly senator who had risen to the throne amidst the chaos, faced disasters on every front. Germanic tribes were pouring across the Rhine and Danube, and a devastating plague was decimating the population. But the most acute and symbolically galling threat was in the east. Shapur I had already proven himself a formidable foe, having previously defeated Roman armies and even captured the great city of Antioch. He was not just a conqueror, he was a propagandist, and he was carving his victories into stone reliefs across Persia, depicting Roman emperors kneeling before him. For Valerian, this was an insult that could not stand. The eastern frontiers were crumbling, and the local commanders seemed unable to stop the Persian advance. In 259 AD, Valerian made his fateful choice. He would leave the western crises to his son and co-emperor Gallienus and travel east himself, taking direct command of the legions. He believed that the presence of the emperor himself, the embodiment of Roman might, would galvanize the troops and reverse the tide of war. It was a decision rooted in an old-fashioned view of imperial duty, but it ignored the brutal reality of Shapor's military genius and the depleted, demoralized state of his own forces. The campaign was a disaster from the start. The Roman army was a shadow of its former self, ravaged by the plague and likely under strength. As Valerian moved into the eastern provinces, Shapur proved a master of maneuver warfare, avoiding a direct pitched battle, the kind of fight where Roman discipline traditionally excelled, and instead harrying the imperial forces, cutting their supply lines and spreading them thin. The decisive moment came somewhere near the city of Edessa. Valerian's army, likely weakened by disease and starvation, found itself trapped by Shapur's highly mobile cavalry, particularly his feared armored cataphracts and horse archers. The exact details are lost to time, but the Roman forces were either decisively defeated in battle or, according to some sources, crippled by a renewed outbreak of the plague that swept through their cramped ranks. What is undeniable is the result. The Roman army was rendered ineffective, and Valerian, rather than dying heroically on the field or committing suicide to avoid capture, made the unprecedented choice to seek a personal parley with Shapur, presumably to negotiate a surrender or a truce. This was the final, catastrophic error. It was a trap. Upon arriving at the meeting, the Roman emperor was abruptly seized by the Persians and taken prisoner. The unthinkable had happened. The Augustus, the Pontifex Maximus, the master of the Roman world, was now a captive of a foreign king. The psychological blow to the Roman world is almost impossible to overstate. The emperor was not just a political leader, he was a semi-divine figure, the guarantor of the empire's covenant with the gods. His capture was not just a military defeat, it was a theological catastrophe that shattered the illusion of Roman invincibility. Shapur, understanding the immense symbolic value of his prize, embarked on a campaign of humiliation that was as brilliant as it was cruel. He did not execute Valerian immediately. Instead, he kept him alive as a trophy, a living testament to his own power. Persian rock carvings at Naksh-e-Rustam vividly depict the scene. Shapur the Great, mounted majestically on his horse, while a kneeling Roman emperor, unmistakably Valerian, supplicates himself before him. According to later Roman and Christian historians, Shapur used his imperial prisoner in the most degrading ways possible. The most infamous story, though its veracity is debated, claims that Valerian was used as a human footstool for the Persian king to mount his horse. Another account, even more gruesome, suggests that after Valerian finally died in captivity, his body was flayed and his skin was stuffed with straw and displayed in a Persian temple as a permanent trophy of victory, a grotesque monument to Persian supremacy. These stories, whether entirely true or embellished, spread like wildfire through the Roman world, poisoning the empire's pride with a potent mixture of horror and shame. The immediate military and political consequences were just as devastating. With the emperor and his entire field army effectively destroyed, the eastern frontier lay completely naked. Shapur's forces ran rampant, sacking cities and looting the wealthy eastern provinces with impunity. The collapse of central authority also gave rise to one of the most fascinating breakaway states in Roman history. The city of Palmyra, under its cunning and ambitious ruler Odenathus, stepped into the power vacuum. With blessing from Valerian's son Gallienus, who was desperately trying to hold the rest of the empire together, Odenathus organized a brilliant defense, using his own Pomeran forces to harry the Persians and eventually push them back, saving the eastern provinces from total annexation. But this salvation came at a cost. Odenathus, and later his famous wife Zenobia, would grow so powerful that they would eventually declare their own independent Pomeran empire, carving a huge chunk of territory away from Rome. Valerian's capture didn't just cause a defeat, it indirectly created a rival empire within the empire's own borders. Valerian's decision stands as the ultimate cautionary tale against an emperor's personal vanity and strategic overreach. In a desperate attempt to embody the old Roman ideal of the emperor-general, he instead exposed the empire's profound weakness. His failure was so complete, his humiliation so absolute, that it became a unique and terrifying landmark in Roman history. He was the only Roman emperor ever to be captured alive by a foreign enemy, a record that would never be broken. His fate served as a grim lesson to all his successors. The prestige of the imperial office was a force to be protected, not gambled on the battlefield, for its loss could bring the entire world crashing down. From the ultimate humiliation of a captured emperor, we now turn to a story not of loss but of breathtaking audacity, a tale of a woman who defied the very foundations of her society to become one of Egypt's greatest pharaohs. In the golden age of the 18th dynasty, a queen was never meant to rule alone. The royal blueprint was clear, a divine king on the throne with his chief wife, the great royal wife, as his support. But when her husband, Thutmose II, died unexpectedly, Hatshepsut found herself in an impossible position. Her stepson and heir, the young Thutmose III, was just an infant, too young to wear the double crown. As his aunt and stepmother, Hatshepsut stepped in as regent, a temporary guardian of the throne until the boy came of age. For the first few years, she ruled conventionally from behind the scenes. But then, she made a decision that would shake the pillars of Egyptian tradition. She ceased being the queen regent and declared herself the one true living king of Egypt. This was far more than a simple power grab. It was a meticulously crafted theological and political revolution. To claim the throne, a pharaoh needed divine legitimacy, a direct connection to the god Amun. Hatshepsut and her brilliant supporters, including the powerful official Senenmut, constructed this legitimacy through a masterful propaganda campaign. She commissioned a stunning narrative carved on the walls of her magnificent mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, depicting her divine birth. In this story, the god Amun himself takes the form of her father, Thutmose I, and conceives her with her mother, Queen Ahmose. Amun then declares before the other gods that she is his chosen daughter, predestined to rule over the two lands. This wasn't just a story, it was a divine mandate, making her rule not an act of usurpation but the fulfillment of a heavenly plan. To physically embody this new role, Hatshepsut underwent a stunning transformation in her official imagery. In statues and reliefs, she gradually shed the form of a woman. She began to be depicted wearing the traditional regalia of a male pharaoh, the Nemes headcloth, the Shendit kilt, and perhaps most famously, the ceremonial false beard. Her titles changed too. She adopted the full five-name titulary of a king, taking the throne name Motker, meaning truth is the soul of Re. In inscriptions, she was referred to with male pronouns. She was the son of Re, the good god, and the lord of the two lands. This was not an attempt to deceive anyone into thinking she was biologically male. Her statues and inscriptions often cleverly blend the forms, combining the male pharaoh's regalia with subtly feminine features like a softer jawline or a slender waist. It was a symbolic performance of kingship, a conscious adoption of the only form that power could take in the Egyptian worldview, the form of a man, and what a king she proved to be. Her 20-year reign was a period of unparalleled peace, prosperity, and architectural magnificence. While later male pharaohs were celebrated for their military conquests, Hatshepsut's legacy was built with stone and trade. She launched a famous trading expedition to the fabled land of Punt, a journey so significant it was lavishly documented on her temple walls. Her ships returned laden with myrrh trees, frankincense, ebony, ivory, gold, and exotic animal skins, reinvigorating Egypt's economy and reinforcing its connections to the wider world. Her building projects were staggering in their scale and elegance. Beyond the sublime terraced temple at Deir el-Bahari, which seems to grow directly from the cliffs of Thebes, she erected towering obelisks at the Temple of Karnak, the tallest in the world at the time. She restored temples across Egypt that had been damaged by the Hyksos invaders generations before, presenting herself as the restorer of Maat, the cosmic order. Yet, despite this record of glorious success, her legacy was violently attacked after her death. Sometime during the Choregency and subsequent sole rule of Thutmose III, a systematic campaign was launched to erase her from history. Her magnificent statues were torn down, smashed, and thrown into pits near her temple. Her cartouches and images were meticulously chiseled off temple walls, often replaced with the names of her father or her stepson. For centuries, Egyptologists, assuming this was an act of vengeful hatred by a resentful Thutmose III, saw it as the ultimate damnatio memoriae. The modern interpretation, however, is far more complex and political. Thutmose III went on to become Egypt's greatest military strategist, a Napoleon of Egypt who expanded the empire to its greatest extent. His own legitimacy, and that of his son Amenhotep II, who continued the erasure, may have depended on reinforcing the strict male-dominated line of succession. Hatshepsut's successful but highly unorthodox reign was a dangerous precedent. By removing her from the official king lists and destroying her monuments, they were not just punishing an individual, they were performing a kind of ideological surgery, cutting out an anomalous branch of the royal family tree to preserve the perfect male line of descent from Thutmose I to Thutmose III and beyond. They were trying to restore a world order where women could not be kings, ensuring that her story would never be used to justify another queen's claim to the throne. Hatshepsut's story forces us to confront profound questions about power, gender, and memory. Her reign demonstrates that the trappings of power are often gendered male, and that to access that power, women throughout history have had to perform a careful and often contradictory balancing act. She had to become a man to do a job that was defined as male, yet she never fully erased her femininity, leaving us with a powerful and enigmatic figure who defies easy categorization. The attempt to erase her also raises a haunting question about historical memory. Who gets to be remembered and why? For over 3,000 years, the conspirators nearly succeeded. But the very effort of their destruction, the fallen statues in the pit, the faint outlines of her chiseled-away image ultimately led to her rediscovery and made her story even more compelling. In the end, the stones themselves refused to forget. Her decision to become king was a gamble of epic proportions, one that secured peace and prosperity for her nation in the moment, but at the cost of her place in its official history, a poignant reminder that those who break the mold often risk being broken by it. If the humiliating capture of Valerian showed an emperor failing on the battlefield, our final controversial decision reveals a ruler failing in the one place an emperor was meant to be safest, his own palace. We now arrive at the twilight of the Western Roman Empire, a period of creeping paralysis, to witness the reign of Emperor Honorius, a man whose defining legacy was not any single disastrous action, but a catastrophic, all-consuming inaction. While barbarian armies tore the very fabric of the empire apart, Honorius's most passionate engagements were fought not against Goths or Vandals, but within the confines of his own aviary. His decision to prioritize the intrigues of his court and the safety of his prized pet chickens over the defense of the ancient world stands as a stunning, almost incomprehensible lesson in negligent leadership. Honorius inherited an empire already on life support. His father, the formidable Theodosius the Great, had temporarily papered over the empire's deep fractures, but upon his death in 395, the Roman world was formally divided between Honorius's older brother Arcadius in the east and the 10-year-old Honorius himself in the west. The child emperor was immediately a pawn, surrounded by powerful regents and generals who saw the throne as a tool for their own ambition. The most powerful of these was the half-Vandal general Stilicho, who served as Honorius's guardian and father-in-law. For a time, Stilicho's military genius held the crumbling frontiers together, fighting off repeated invasions by the Visigothic king Alaric. But Honorius, weak-willed, suspicious, and easily influenced by a court faction jealous of Stilicho's power, made his first fatal decision. In 408, he accused his most capable defender of treason and had him executed. This act of stunning self-sabotage not only decapitated the Roman military leadership, but also enraged the thousands of barbarian foederati soldiers loyal to Stilicho, who promptly defected to Alaric's side, massively swelling the Goths' ranks and giving him the strength he needed to march on Rome itself. With Stilicho gone, Honorius's true character was laid bare. He retreated to the heavily fortified coastal capital of Ravenna, a city surrounded by impenetrable marshes, and there he effectively sealed himself off from the world. His court became a sealed echo chamber of flatterers and eunuchs, where the most pressing matters of state were not barbarian invasions or food shortages, but elaborate ceremonies, complex dynastic plots, and the care of the emperor's beloved poultry. The historian Procopius famously recounted that when a courtier arrived with the news that Rome had been sacked, a horrified Honorius cried out, "And yet it has just eaten from my hands." Believing the report was about his favorite rooster, which he had named Roma, only when the messenger clarified that it was the city of Rome that had been destroyed did the emperor breathe a sigh of relief. While this story may be apocryphal, it perfectly encapsulates the profound disconnect between the emperor's insulated reality and the apocalyptic suffering of his subjects. This willful blindness reached its horrific climax in 410. Alaric and his Goths, who had been camped outside Rome for months, were not initially intent on destruction. They were a people desperate for food and land, and they sought negotiation, offering to spare the city in exchange for a treaty and payment. But Honorius, safe behind the walls of Ravenna, refused to even engage in serious talks, sending mixed messages and ultimately stonewalling the Goths. His decision was a calculated, cold-hearted gamble. He believed the legendary walls of Rome were impregnable and that Alaric would eventually give up and leave. He was wrong. Frustrated, hungry, and enraged by the emperor's contemptuous indifference, Alaric's forces stormed the Salarian Gate on August 24th. For 3 days, the Visigoths sacked the Eternal City, the first time a foreign enemy had breached its walls in 800 years. Though the physical destruction was less than often imagined, the psychological impact was earth-shattering. The news sent a shockwave throughout the entire ancient world. Saint Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, lamented, "The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken." To people across the empire, it felt as if the universe itself had been unraveled. Honorius's reign did not end with the sack of Rome. He lived on for another 23 years, a testament to the resilience of the imperial office even as the state it governed withered away. But his legacy of neglect set an irreversible trajectory. His refusal to address the real problems, the barbarian groups settling within the empire's borders, the collapsing economy, the crippling tax burden, meant that each crisis was worse than the last. By the time of his death in 423, the Western Empire was a hollow shell. Provinces in Britain and Gaul had been abandoned, Spain was overrun, and Africa, the breadbasket that fed Italy, was soon to be lost to the Vandals. The army was now almost entirely composed of barbarian mercenaries whose loyalty was to their own commanders, not to Rome. Honorius had not just presided over the decline, he had actively accelerated it through a policy of apathy. His decision to look inward, to tend to his own small world while the larger one burned, demonstrates a haunting truth, that the most dangerous force in history is not always malicious intent, but sometimes a profound and catastrophic lack of interest. The fall of Rome was not a single event but a process of decay, and no one did less to stop it than the emperor who was meant to be its greatest defender. And so our journey through the halls of ancient power comes to a close, but the echoes of these 25 controversial decisions continue to resonate across the centuries. From the paranoid theatrics of Nero to the calculated revolutions of Akhenaten, from the brilliant gambles of Hannibal to the catastrophic arrogance of Belshazzar, we see the same fundamental forces at play: the intoxicating allure of absolute power, the blinding nature of unchecked ambition, and the universal human fallibility that connects every ruler, no matter how divine they claim to be. These leaders, whether motivated by what they saw as divine wisdom, cold political strategy, sheer madness, or desperate survival, all made choices that sent shockwaves through their civilizations, choices that teach us that leadership is never just about the moment of decision, but about grappling with the endless chain of consequences that follow. What becomes strikingly clear is that there is no single blueprint for a controversial decision. For every Cyrus the Great whose enlightened tolerance forged a stable empire, there is a Theodosius whose enforced unity came at the cost of cultural destruction. For every Hatshepsut whose unprecedented rule brought peace and prosperity, there is a Commodus whose vanity nearly shattered the foundations of the Roman state. History's judgment is rarely simple, often forcing us to weigh brilliant outcomes against deeply flawed methods, or to separate tragic short-term results from unintended long-term benefits that shaped the modern world. These stories challenge us to move beyond easy labels of good or evil, and to instead understand the immense pressure, the limited information, and the colossal stakes that these men and women faced. Ultimately, these ancient dramas offer us timeless lessons on the nature of power itself. They teach us about the dangers of hubris, the fragility of empires built on fear, the strategic value of mercy, and the unforeseen costs of radical change. They remind us that the most enduring legacies are often not the grandest monuments, but the wisdom or folly embedded in the choices a leader makes. The stories of Akhenaten's heresy, Caesar's river crossing, and Constantine's vision have shaped our world in profound ways, proving that the past is never truly past. Now we want to hear from you. Which of these 25 controversial decisions shocked you the most? Was it Caligula's war on the sea, Valerian's catastrophic capture, or perhaps Psamtik's gamble on foreign mercenaries that you found most compelling? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We love diving into these discussions with you. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the minds of ancient leaders, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss our next exploration into history's greatest mysteries. Until next time,